You step into a lamplit guildhall, where the air tastes of beeswax and damp wool. Lanterns puddle gold onto scarred oak. Masters huddle around a trestle, murmuring numbers like monks at psalms. A clerk strokes a tally board. You pull the door to with your hip, shoulders relaxing into the room's warm gravity. The work of bread, quiet, exact. A little political waits like a patient cat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now, city and local hour, please. I love seeing the map glow. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The guildmaster raises 2 fingers. The room hushes like dough after a fold. Allotments, the clerk says, and tokens clack like polite thunder. Fine white for feasts, browns for daily steadiness, each name called, each debt remembered. You nod when yours is spoken, and the number lands with the pleasant ache of responsibility. Here's the steady fact that anchors you. In towns like this, bread is regulated like a heartbeat. In 13th century England, the Assize of Bread and Ale sets permitted price and weight. Constables can seize loaves that cheat the scales, and bakers risk fines that sting worse than oven burns. Across the continent, councils and guilds keep similar ledgers. Flour equals order. Order keeps night from growing teeth. The masters recite the rule, half liturgy, half insurance, then argue softly about moisture in sacks and the week's chilly wind. A laugh slides in like steam under a door. Someone swears the miller upriver watered the river to stretch the grind. You promise, deadpan, to taste the water wheel for notes of dilution. The room exhales a small smile. That was joke 1. Wait's next. Brass pans flash like small moons, and sample loaves settle with a hush. Your round sits square, a methodical crumb under a shy blistered crust. The eldest master leans so close his eyebrows threaten to score it. His grunt could mean excellent or acceptable. You accept both. Better to be a reliable candle than an exploding star. Quirky tidbit, while the clerk turns the hourglass. This town requires every baker to mark loaves before they vanish into the communal oven stamps, slashes, little sigils pressed by thumb or tool. You use a wheat ear with a crooked vein. A child once said it looked like a sleepy fish, and ever since you've loved it more. When the warden rakes out a galaxy of rounds, he knows which cosmos is yours. Business ambles. Fuel is counted faggots and billets stacked to the rafters. The woodyard came late. A cart lost a wheel and rolled into gossip for an hour. Someone mentions hairline cracks in the Westgate oven crown. A mason is promised. The scorch looked like St. Martin. An apprentice offers, and you let superstition drift on. Luck can ride along, you think. Just don't hand it the reins. Guilds are families with bylaws. You paid entrance with years and a masterpiece loaf that did not sigh itself flat. Belonging means candles at funerals, coins toward bridges, and loaves for alms when famine snarls. Your craft isn't only heat, it's neighbourhood. Debate curls like smoke, permitted variances, inspector routes, the price of salt after last week's coastal storm. Then the talk tilts into a rabbit hole you adore. Historians still argue whether the famous baker's dozen began as a hedge against medieval penalties for short wait in London, or whether it gelled later from friendlier retail habit. You shrug a theatrical maybe, and promise to put an extra roll in a fussy customer's bag just in case the 13th century is still watching. Your slot at the communal oven is posted, 3rd firing before dawn. Perfect. You can mix and rest the dough while the bells pace your work. First mix. Warm water, old leaven, flour. Salt last like a blessing. Your wrists already move in your imagination. Another anchor. In many towns, communal ovens are lordly property bakehouse monopolies woven into manorial rights. Families queue with tokens. The warden tends heat and keeps the peace. You respect him, a priest of fire in a leather cap, because he reads a hearth the way sailors read sky. He'll test the floor with a pinch of flour. If it flashes dark, you wait. If it toasts to blonde, you load. You sign the ledger with flour-dusted fingers, accidentally baptizing a column. The clerk sighs the sigh of a man who loves straight lines. I'll bring a damp cloth next time, you promise, and his mouth almost remembers how to smile. That's joke 2. A cup travels the circle, ale spiced with something that pretends to be clove and gives up halfway. You sip. You probably won't survive this, your inner narrator mutters, tallying the hours between now and sunrise. Mixing, folding, dividing, shaping, proofing, loading, praying, unloading, cooling, carrying, selling. You answer with a yawn and the simple truth that you always do. Dawn likes competent people. You intend to be one. The meeting loosens into practical kindness. Someone offers spare linen. You offer a wry trick for cold nights. Damp cloth, patient breath, a joke told to the bowl. A younger baker asks about scoring. You describe shallow confidence and a swift wrist, then add that decorative peacocks are fun until the inspector wonders why a peacock weighs less than bread. Laughter patters like flour on a bench. Joke 3, neatly shaped. Hoods go up. Sacks are shouldered with the private grunts of people who lift for a living. The big door opens on night like a lake, black and glossy. You step through and feel the world narrow to cobbles, frost and purpose. Your breath smokes. On the walk you pass a shutter where a candle pinches itself out. The street tries on silence again. You like this hour when town and task fit no wasted heat, no wasted steps. Nothing loud but your thoughts folding like dough. By the time you reach your workshop, your starter when you lift the cloth answers with 1,000 friendly bubbles. It smells faintly of apples and clean rain. You stir, feed, wait. The scale gleams. The guildhalls' lanterns fade, but their logic stays. Quotas set, prices fair, rivalries kept to a civilized simmer. You tie on your apron. The stillness gives you room. You hear what you need, wood settling, water thinking, flower breathing, and you begin. You shoulder a sack the colour of late summer and listen to the grain whisper, a dry rain inside the canvas. It began in manor fields under a sun that forgot moderation, with reapers stooping row after row, then bundling sheaves into stooks that stood like little congregations, praying for weather that behaved. You weren't there for the harvest, but you can feel it. The rhythm of sickle and breath, the rustle of straw cuffs against wrists, the occasional curse when a thistle takes liberties. In the tithe balm the church took its share, and the Lord took his, because medieval math is mostly the art of you dividing and someone else multiplying. Tonight, your share is grain that needs to be convinced into flour. You trail the cart to the watermill, wheels squeaking in a counterpoint to the creek's cold talk. The mill appears like a tamed thunderhead, a house whose heart beats in circles. Water hurries into the launder, plunges through the wheel, and the building hums with a patient growl that you feel in your knees. You rap the door. The miller's dog inspects your shins and, finding only dignity, allows passage. Here's your steady fact. Medieval Europe harnesses water like a second set of hands. The Domesday Book around 1086 lists thousands of mills across England, old stone engines that turn rivers into bread. You stand by one now, warm where the machinery throws off its fatigue, watching the miller adjust the sluice. He speaks fluent splash. You admire his vocabulary. He spreads your grain in the hopper with a flourish that suggests he has done this since before eyebrows were invented. You note his famous miller's thumb, the pad broad and sensitive from years of testing grist. A thumb said to feel fineness the way a lute player feels harmony. Quirky tidbit. Some folk insist millers grow gold on that thumb from skimming. Others say it's simply callous and talent. You choose talent, the way you choose clean aprons and honest weights. The stones talk. The runner stone spins above the bedstone, and together they nibble the kernel into pale weather. The smell is green and warm, sweeter than you expect, like promises keeping themselves. The miller leans close, listening for the fine hiss that means the stones are neither kissing nor quarrelling. He shows you the dress of the stone grooves cut in patterns that look like geometry inventing itself. French burr is admired here, he tells you, hard and keen. Local grit does the job but needs more love. The river adds its steady metronome. Your shoulders loosen. You didn't know machinery could purr you toward drowsy. You try a joke because the hour likes them. You tap the stone rim and ask whether he takes requests, perhaps a lullaby in C major. He snorts, which in Miller is raucous laughter. Joke one lands and sprinkles brown around it. While the wheel turns, the miller charges his fee. A toll in kind called multure. You pay in handfuls grain becoming flour, flour becoming his supper. It's an arrangement as old as the river's stubbornness. Outside, moonlight lays sheet music on the mill pond. Inside, you watch your future loaves drift down as meal, light as chaff, heavy as duty. You cup the stream and rub it between finger and thumb. There's grit yet. Flour feels alive because it is warm from friction, breathing with the ghost of field and water, flecked with germ that refuses to stop being seed just because you said please. The bag fills and the night sighs. You haul your share home, but the work isn't done. Flour is a spectrum, and you need to choose your note. In the workshop you set out sieves like nested moons. Coarse horsehair for one pass, fine linen for the next. And if you are feeling fancy on feast weeks or when a bishop thinks about visiting silk bolting cloth that turns meal into floating snow, your arms memorize the sweep, shake, tap, lift, and the bran peels away like bark from a story. You keep bran for porridges and for the neighbour with hens who gossip loudly and lay loyally. Scholars still argue whether fine bolted white bread was common among townsfolk or mostly a luxury for tables with enough candles to read by during lunch. Your hands suggest a compromise. Most days brown, sometimes mixed, and on festivals, a white that glows like good news. You are not in the business of kings, but you can stage a small coronation in a crust when the almoner asks. You pause to weigh a handful habit born at the guild table. Moisture tells you secrets. The river lent warmth. The air tonight is sharp. You adjust tomorrow's water in your head and tuck away a spoon of leaven for its midnight snack. A stray thought, like a cat, rubs your ankle. Ergot, the fungus that haunts rye and damp seasons, firing rumours of saintly visions and very unsaintly convulsions. Historians still argue whether outbreaks were as frequent as folklorists claim, or whether later writers braided many scares into one dramatic rope. Either way, vigilance is a spice you add for free. Grain inspected, bins kept sweet, bad whispers sifted out with the bran. You set the hand quern beside the bench, a two-stone argument you use when the watermill sleeps or the cartwheel sulks. You grind a small batch for comparison, the upper stone heavy and obliging under your palm. It is slow, humbling, a meditation that tightens your forearms and makes you love rivers more. The sound is less thunder, more whispering teeth. You taste both meals with the tip of your tongue like a careful sorcerer. The quern's flour is warmer, a little coarser. The mill's is even, calm. You blend them, because blending is where craft proves it isn't a hobby. Time for joke 2. You tell the apprentice, who has drifted in like a moth to lamplight, that you prefer your flour al dente. He stares, blinks, then laughs late, which is the best kind of laugh, one that arrives like bread out of the oven when you had given up smelling it. He offers to crank the quern and discovers why forearms exist. You pretend not to enjoy his surprise too much. On the shelf lies your sieve brush bore bristle bound with a thread you replaced twice. You sweep with the tender impatience of a baker who knows the dough will magnify whatever laziness you invite into it. A pinch of salt between finger and thumb, testing for damp that might clump tomorrow's measure. You listen to the room, rafters settling, the slow breath of the banked hearth, the shy fizz of starter waking in its bowl like a pond after rain. Another sturdy fact, tucked into the folds. In many regions, lords once claimed banal rights over mills, ovens, and presses, obliging tenants to use them for a fee. That monopoly built roads and quarried stones, but it also built a reputation for millers as men who could count better than saints. You keep your ledgers clean because a clean ledger is sleep in table form. The miller keeps his because he knows you bake with memory. The apprentice asks if flour spoils. You answer that it does, sooner than pride. Wholemeal turns shy first because the germ carries oils that grow impatient. Keep it cool, keep it steady, use it like you mean it. He nods, pockets the advice like a coin that doesn't jingle. You watch him run a palm through the flour and grin. Another quirky tidbit. Some bakers taste walk across a pile bare footstep, pressed lightly to feel moisture gradations, then wipe the sole with the same solemnity people save for reliquaries. You don't do that here. The inspector would combust. Joke 3. Dusted and done. By now the sacks sit like obedient oxen, labelled and tied. You mark the bolted batch with your sleepy fish, because brands travel faster than gossip. When you heft a cloth, flour lifts in a breath that glows in lamplight. Snow that doesn't melt, a small blizzard you command. You pat it back to earth, and the room quiets, as if the grain understands the ceremony of becoming bread and would like to behave. You run a last palm over the bench and feel nothing but readiness. The river has done its part, the stones, theirs, your hands, enough for tonight. Outside, the lane sips frost. Inside, the flour waits like moon dust for a tide. You reach for the bowl, and the bowl agrees. Tomorrow has edges you can hold now. You bring out the brass like a small constellation pans bright as twin moons, counterweights stamped with lions and lilies, pebbled smooth by a century of honest palms and a few nervous ones. The bench remembers the rhythm. Place, breathe, balance. Flour still sifts in the air from your sieves, a shy snow that settles on everything except your certainty. You reach for the ledger and the quill that always leans slightly left, like it has politics. Tonight is weigh and whisper night, when numbers learn manners. You test the scale the way you test a friendship first with something small. A walnut sits, a half-ounce soldier, the arm floats, hesitates, then rests at even. Good. You smile at the pan and tell it to keep that energy. The pan pretends not to hear. Pans are stoics. Joke one stretches and yawns, content to stay soft. Once the weights behave, you pile the flour you've pledged for tithe and dues. Medieval life is a braid. Your loaf will pay for heat and stone, and someone else's book of hours. A tenth for the church in kind when the priest asks grain or coin or finished loaves. Depending on the pact, another slice for the Lord's bakehouse fee, and your guild contribution, which buys candles for funerals, benches for meetings, and the privilege of arguing about what just moist means for dough. The tithe isn't a surprise, it's a tide. You mark it in the ledger with calm script that leaves room for sleep later. Here's your steady fact, crisp as crust. The Assize of Bread and Ale in England, and similar regulations elsewhere, tied the permitted weight of a loaf to the going price of grain. When grain rose dear, the loaf stayed the same price but shrank. When grain fell cheap, the loaf plumped up. Inspectors checked with scales and sample weights, and bakers who played fast and loose found their names playing even faster on town lips. The logic is tidy, economic physics expressed in crumb. You keep a set of assize pebbles in a pouch, little round stones you picked from a riverbed and weighed against official lead. They're friendlier in the hand, and on cold nights they keep their temper when metal grows snippy. Quirky tidbit. Some bakers swear by warming their brass weights on the hearth before a check, claiming cold metal lies heavy. You tried it once. The inspector arched an eyebrow so high you saw tomorrow. Since then, your weights stay temperate, and your humour warmer than your pans. Dues paid, you weigh out your own flour for the night's mix under the posted quotas. The guild's allotment is part arithmetic, part peace treaty. No one wants a week of fights because one household snatched every grain like a magpie with ambition. You annotate the page with your sleepy fish mark so the clerk won't accuse you of borrowing someone else's handwriting. Across town, the warden of weights dreams of catching you short. You hope he dreams of long naps instead. You think of the inspector as a human metronome, boots regular, notebook regulated. He tastes bread with a ritual pinch, crumb between finger and thumb, head tilted as if listening to angels gossip. Some towns give him a staff with the town's seal on it. Others give him a large moustache for emphasis. Joke 2 peeks out. You imagine his moustache calibrated to the L, quivering when a loaf misbehaves. You will not say that aloud. Not again. Taxes shape more than coin. They shape the loaf itself. Salt rates matter after storms. The price can rise like a yeast with opinions. You've learned to adjust with grace. A whisper less salt, a little more patience, a longer bench rest so the dough can remember who it is without getting briny. The Lord's forest law affects your oven. If firewood grows scarce under strict wardens, you plan smaller batches, tighter schedules, loaves that love hot, quick kisses instead of long embraces. You don't resent the web, you navigate it. Craft is a way of saying yes while steering the yes where you need it. Historians still argue whether the Assize's enforcement was steady across small market towns or mostly bark with only occasional bite, a ceremony that kept everyone agreeable while real weights waltzed in back rooms. Your ledger has its opinion neat columns, no crossings out, nothing that tastes of panic. But you admit memory is a generous editor, and stories have a way of removing the awkward feet from their dances. You hang the scale, step back, and fetch the test loaves. Yesterday's smalls baked for practice, and for exactly this moment. They're modest rounds that tell the truth about your hand. You line them like planets, each stamped with the sleepy fish, each cooled to the same hour. The balance accepts them, one by one, and the beam hums level. You nod. Your hands and your numbers still share a language. Punishments, you remind yourself, can be theatrical. In some places, bakers found short might ride a cart with bad bread strung like scandal round their necks, or spend an hour in the pillory being explained to by tomatoes. You don't plan to audition. Instead, you keep a habit. The baker's dozen. 13 where 12 are ordered. Not to run afoul of myths, but to run ahead of anger. It's cheap insurance and excellent advertising. You tell the apprentice, generosity is lighter than fines. He says, so is Bran. You allow him that small triumph. A customer arrives early, Marjorie with the linen stall, who seems to own both every rumour and 3/4 of the town's smiles. She asks about the week's price, tipping her head so her coif does the arithmetic first. You explain what the guild posted. Same coin, lighter loaf by a finger width while barley sulks in the fields. She sucks her teeth and announces she will buy 2 and eat them more slowly. You assure her that slowness increases flavour, just like courtesy. She considers, then pays, then confides that the beadle tripped over a goose. You mark the coin, stifle the grin, log the goose. Your bench hosts a small theatre of weights, half-pounds, cosy with ounces, a mysterious fraction labelled in an ancestor's flourish. You check them against the town's standard iron in a ritual you perform monthly with the solemnity of a saint's day. The standard lives in a chest at the Guildhall like a relic. Iron nested in wood, wood nested in a rule that says fairness is a public object. You bring the apprentice to watch, because nothing grows morality like a scale that refuses to flatter. There's a different tithe you pay without writing it down. The alms loaf. On cold mornings, you portion a bowl of dough into small rounds without stamps, brush them with water, and slide them in at the window heat. They travel to hands that don't own weights, and they pay an old debt you feel without vocabulary. It's not bookkeeping, it's keeping. The town knows. It pays you back in the way doors open when your arms are full. You think of substitution too, the honest and the sneaky. Cheat once named a type of lighter wheat bread, not a moral failing. Maslin mixed wheat and rye into one loaf fit for Tuesday. You don't lie in dough, you declare your blends. But you've seen bakers cut corners ere whipped into loaves as if oxygen counts as grain. Damp dough weighed quick before it breathes out. The inspector's mustache quivers in your mind again. You breathe the thought away. By the window, the town muffles itself in fur and frost. The bell at St. Bride's coughs a quarter. Time to convert numbers into touch. You count out the salt, pile the flour, and draw a circle in the bowl with the edge of your hand, a habit like tracing a map you've already memorized. The starter yawns awake. You pour water in a ribbon. The scale retires with dignity to its hook, and your hands take over the conversation. Joke 3 arrives with the dough hook. You tell the apprentice that if inspectors ever weigh your jokes, you'll have to pay a fine for being too light. He says they should tax your puns at the source. You promise to register with the Guild of Groans. Laughter patters like flour, then quiet returns, practical and kind. If someone stopped you now and asked what taxes shape bread, you'd show them palms dusted with policy, the tithe that keeps candles burning, the Lord's fee that keeps ovens from collapsing, the assize that keeps coin and crumb in civilized conversation. The rest is you, your scale, your ledger, your patience. You tuck the ledger closed, breathe once, and trade math for muscle. The knight leans closer, approving. The lane slopes toward the Lord's bakehouse like a thought finding its sentence. Curfew has lifted. A door unlatches. A cloak whispers by. And you join the small procession of baskets and breath clouds angling for heat. The oven squats in its stone apron, a domed animal yawning fire. Smoke does its early morning ribbon dance, testing the wind the way a cat tests a visitor. You feel the temperature on your cheeks before the flames show you their teeth. Your token carved wood stamped with the warden's mark rests in your palm, warm from being worried. Everyone worries their token. It's what hands do while patience does its slow miracle. Neighbours line themselves like punctuation. Marjorie, the linen seller, in a comma of shawls. The beadle's wife with a full stop of a frown. 3 apprentices shaped like exclamation points. 2 sleepy children whose eyes are parentheses, half closed, holding dreams they refuse to give back. The warden leather cap, iron rake, a voice that could spread butter on stone calls numbers from a tally board, and the oven answers with a low, agreeable rumble. You trade nods the way sailors trade weather. A morning queue is a truce. Rival bakers shoulder to shoulder. Private ovens sleeping while the communal mouth wakes. Here's the steady fact that likes to go first. Across much of medieval Europe, especially in parts of France, the four banal, the Lord's obligated oven, tethered communities to a single hearth. Tenants paid to bake there, part fee, part fire insurance for a town built of beams and thatch. In other regions, municipalities or guilds ran the bakehouses, but the idea held. One big, well-maintained heat beats 20 dangerous small ones. The warden's rake is less a tool than a title. You greet him, and he grunts the grunt of recognition that means you usually behave. He is priest, traffic marshal, meteorologist. He reads the colour of the dome black soot now paling to a surprised tan, as the first fire kisses the bricks back awake. He rakes coals into a shallow tide, tucks faggots along the sides, and feeds the beast with a rhythm that talks of years. Someone tells the old joke about bread rising because it's embarrassed to be seen naked in public. The apprentices emit the polite cough that passes for laughter at this hour. Joke 1 sniffs the air and decides to live. Your basket holds rounds stamped with the sleepy fish loaves you'll proof nearby, until the warden sings the note that means load. The bench by the oven wall is warm enough to soften your shoulders. You mark time by small things. The little scorches on the lintel that look like stars, the way the warden's left boot squeaks only when he pivots, the chalk doodle of a saint someone rendered with more enthusiasm than skill. You offer a silent prayer to Saint Honoré, patron of your people, on the principle that gratitude is never wasted. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your cap. In some towns, households carried personal wooden markers, pegs or paddles with carved symbols to tag their batches on the peel for the warden to track. More elaborate than simple slashes, these could depict anything from a goose to a pair of shears, and at least one family used a tiny shoe. It made sense. If your life is measured in loaves, you might as well give each one a story on its way to the flame. You run a thumb over your sleepy fish, and feel the oil rubbed into the stamp by years of small pressings. It smells faintly of walnut and superstition. Test! The warden barks, and the line leans forward as if one spine. He flicks a pinch of flour against the oven floor. It flashes to brown in a heartbeat. Not black, not pale. The colour of a good joke halfway through its telling. He nods. He swipes the peel's edge on the sill, with a motion that might be affection. You swear he kisses the handle when he thinks no one is looking. It can't hurt. The oven believes in small rituals too. Loading order is choreography. Tokens clack into a bowl, and names follow them like obedient dogs. Your third. The first baker slides in Small's rolls that twitch at the heat and settle as if showing the oven how to behave. You feel your arms remember. The peel is a wing in your hands, and the mouth opens for you because you've learned its language. Small twist, firm push, a whisper to the loaf to be brave. Steam smells like green things made into comfort. The dome glows the colour of honey yearning toward amber. A child asks if the oven ever sleeps. The warden says it dozes with one eye open. You add that oven's dream in crust crackles and wake when someone mentions raisins. The child considers you as if you're a travelling wizard and decides your beard, you don't have one, confirms it. Joke 2 warms its hands. While heat builds, the gossip economy gets to work. Marjorie reports that the miller's dog has learned to nod at correct sums. The beadle's wife announces her goose is innocent of tripping any officials. The apprentices agree to disagree about everything with the spectacular speed of youth. In the back, a widow counts her coins twice, then presses them flat against each other, as if that makes more money grow. You slip a small roll from last night onto her bench and look away quickly, as if windows were fascinating. The warden pretends he is deeply concerned with a coal that has never misbehaved in its life. Historians still argue whether queues at communal ovens were strictly egalitarian, first token, first bake, or whether influence, title, and loudness tugged the order like fishermen tugging a net. Your town claims fairness, and most mornings lives up to it. On feast days, things get creative. Today is a plain day pretending to be special because you're in it. You pass the time with small calibrations. You tap your proofing boards with the back of a fingernail and listen for the hollow that means readiness. You pinch a dough edge and watch it spring with a laziness that reads as perfect. You brush flour off your apron and discover your apron is more loyal to flour than to you. The warden calls your name, and your feet move before your ears agree. Inside the dome, the floor is a horizon of possibilities. You place your rounds in a circle that feels like good civic planning, lanes clear, neighbours friendly, exits obvious. You mark locations in your head. Sleepy fish at north, 2 at east, 3 at south, a shy orphan at west. The peel becomes an extension of intention. You withdraw, close the wooden door, and the soft thump feels like the end of an argument you won with kindness. Outside, everyone exhales. The oven hums, a big cat satisfied. Mainstream fact, easy as lungful. Communal bakehouses weren't just ovens, they were social engines. Notices got posted here. Watchmen warmed their hands, messengers paused, arms found pockets. Occasional town meetings dissolved into bread-scented gossip and back again. The oven was a practical hearth in a public square, proof that infrastructure can be tender. No one wrote it that way, but your nose knows. While the fire evens out, you step to the water tub and wet your hands. The beadle's wife eyes your loaf stamps and asks why your fish is sleepy. You say it's because your loaves rise at ungodly hours, which is nearly theology. She snorts and claims she can smell short weight from the street. You reply that the inspector's moustache can smell it from 2 streets over. The apprentices try not to laugh and fail, gloriously. Joke 3 takes a bow. A superstition floats by, light as chaff. An old man says if a loaf cracks with a sound like a sigh, a traveller will arrive before noon. Another counters that a crack like a giggle means rain. You accept both with the same polite nod you give cloud shapes. Quirky addendum. Some swear by laying a sprig of rosemary on the sill to discourage oven spirits from nipping crusts. Others tie a red thread to the peel to keep loaves from wandering into scorch. You've tried neither. You trust temperature and the stubborn mercy of well-fed leaven. The warden peeks, pivots, pulls. Your heart does the quick step it always does. What if today the mother yeast forgot the choreography? But the door swings, and the first loaves show their ears brown, proud, a little glossy where steam met starch. Crust sings that tiny song it sings, a cooling crackle like rain on parchment. Your sleepy fish look alert, which is the only kind of irony you allow at breakfast. You tap one. It answers with the hollow note that means your night spent its hours wisely. Tokens return like homing pigeons, landing in your hand with the quiet click of a tally completed. You stack hot rounds in your basket, stagger them so they don't steam each other into dishonesty, and slide a peel back to the warden's stand with a practiced wrist flick. He grunts approval. You receive it like a medal pinned invisibly to your apron. He offers you the smallest corner of a cinnamon rumour someone's cousin carried spice from a ship with striped sails. You file it under tomorrow. And also Union grade to the jack. By the time your second batch is in, the queue has thinned to domestic seriousness. Stews to be revived, oatcakes to be charmed, a pie that swears it will keep quiet, and then sighs anyway. You offer to wait for the widow's little loaf. She refuses, which means yes. You wait. When the last door thumps and the warden banks the coals for the hour's rest, the lane smells of crust and something like relief. You shoulder your basket and your mourning, and the town receives both gladly. Heat rides with you like a tame dragon. Your loaves speak softly to one another in the basket, cooling, settling, deciding who will make which child quiet and which father kinder. You smile at the thought and at the truth behind it. Bread makes mornings gentler than they deserve. You head toward the mist that wants to be sunlight, and the oven purrs behind you like a satisfied rumour. Back in your shop, the room is a small chapel to patience. You lift the cloth from your leaven like a stage curtain, and the bowl answers with a soft orchard smell apples and something pleasantly tangy, as if the air itself has been practicing scales. The surface trembles with bubbles that look like tiny glass bells. You tip the bowl and the leaven sighs, elastic and self-assured. It's alive in the way good ideas are, quietly opinionated. You feed yesterday's starter because tomorrow deserves inheritance. A handful of flour, a sip of warm water, a turn of the wrist that feels like winding a clock you made yourself. You scrape down the sides with the calm of someone who has decided not to fight gravity before breakfast. The leaven leans toward the spoon with slow affection. You grin, yes, you're sentimental about a jar of microbes. You've seen worse romances. Joke 1 winks from behind the jar like a friend who approves of your life choices. Mainstream fact to tuck in your sleeve. Much of medieval leavening rides, either on old dough, a piece of yesterday's fermented paste worked into today's mix, or on barm, the yeasty foam skimmed from ale. In brewing towns, barm can be a baker's best gossip. In quieter places, sour cultures rule the hearth. You work both roads, but your heart favours the old dough that knows your bench by name. It gives loaves the taste of continuity, brown, round and civilised. You pinch off the mother piece, flour it lightly, and nest it in a small wooden box lined with linen and hope. Some bakers keep theirs in a lidded pot, others under a bowl, a few, you swear, in a place of honour, as if it were an elderly aunt. Quirky tidbit. There's a rumour. A village 3 valleys north names their starters and invites them to weddings, so the bread won't feel left out. You haven't seen the invitations, but you've seen the bread. It danced. You test the live culture the way the warden tests a hearth, a little spoonful dropped in warm water. If it floats like a satisfied duck, you mix. If it sulks and sinks, you scold it kindly and give it another half hour of encouragement. Today, it floats. It also looks smug. You allow the smugness. It earned it. Salt next measured, not guessed. You run a thumb over the crystals as if reading a tiny map. Salt is the quiet law in dough. Without it, the yeast parties without paying the bill. Your fingers pause over the pouch because prices still listen to storms more than to reason. The gabelle, that infamously uneven salt tax across parts of France, reminds you that governments sometimes season bread from very far away, and the bill lingers on the tongue. You measure with the care of a scribe tracing a sacred letter. The apprentice watches as if you are disarming a trap. In a way, you are. You pour water that remembers the mill's cold story, but has been gently persuaded to something kinder. You stir leaven into it until the bowl turns a little cloudy, the way a morning turns into day. Flour follows first, the bolted white for tenderness, then the mixed meal for honesty. You rake the pile into the liquid centre, and the dry islands surrender one by one. A spoon is useful for a minute. Then hands speak the mother tongue. You rotate, fold, press. Rotate, fold, press, the motion a prayer with elbows. Dough answers by developing a memory of itself, from sticky complaint to agreeable strength. Is it ready? The apprentice asks, leaning so close his curiosity fogs the bowl. It will tell us, you say. He looks at you the way people look at the sky, and demand to know whether it plans weather. You point out the cues. The skin gathers shine, the tear edges round off. The stickiness becomes affectionate rather than clingy. He nods like a man who just met a cat and avoided bleeding. Joke 2 purrs softly. You pause to do the window pane test, stretching a piece until it thins to a translucent veil that holds before it surrenders. Not all medieval benches fuss so much, but you like clarity, and gluten likes respect. You bench rest the dough beneath a damp cloth and the room's hum gets quieter, as if walls listen when flour thinks. Historians still argue whether barm bread dominated urban markets across centuries, or waxed and waned with brewing cycles, leaving sourdough to shoulder the quiet days. Records hint both ways. Alehouses spilling generosity in one decade, then guilds favouring leaven in another. You're not here to referee, you're here to keep what rises rising. So you fold again, gentle turns at intervals, teaching structure without stealing breath. Between folds, you tidy your salt jar and sniff it, habit, not suspicion. A story surfaces. A baker you met once claimed he could judge a merchant by his salt alone. Clean ocean, grim evaporations, or a cellar with opinions. He also insisted a single bay leaf kept salt spry in damp weather. You adopt the leaf. Belief follows obediently behind function. 3 folds in, the dough sits poised, elastic like an argument you're winning. You wet your hands and stroke the surface to smooth any last tantrums. You divide by feel and by the brass weights that still smell faintly of the Guildhall. Rounds push back under your palms like well-fed cats, then relax when you insist. You shape tight boules for daily comfort, and a few longer loaves for customers who swear slices taste nobler when geometry stretches. You stamp your sleepy fish, firm and fond. The stamp leaves a promise. This will be yours even after the oven tries to convince you everything is community property. You set baskets with flowered linens, the ghosts of yesterday's loaves faint on their weave. If you had splurged on cane bannetons from a far merchant, you might fuss about spirals. Today, willow and linen are plenty grand. You nest the rounds, seam up, and cover them with cloths that smell of soap, sun, and the idea that laundry day will one day be less dramatic. While proof happens, you mix a small bowl of feast dough more white, a pinch of spice someone smuggled through the market under the name Yule dust. Not for today, but for practice, because the calendar expects you to produce miracles on schedule. The apprentice pinches a speck to taste and declares it tastes like expensive. You agree. A superstition creeps to the sill and sits. Don't whistle at dough, or it will sulk. Don't count aloud, or it will seize stubbornly at the number 7. Do stroke the cloth as you pass, because dough appreciates manners. Quirky side note, one baker swears a copper coin under the bowl steadies winter ferment. Another swears a copper coin under the bowl attracts thieves bold enough to flip tables. You try neither today. You trust warmth, time, and that smug little float test. You check proof by the gentle poke. The indentation springs back slowly, a lazy tide returning. The room smells like comfort rehearsing. You lift a basket to your ear and, though you know it's nonsense, you swear you hear faint fizzing carbonic gossip. The apprentice leans in and agrees he hears it too. Perhaps you both do. Perhaps you like believing you do. Some truths are shaped like bread. You know they're there because your hands say so. Joke 3 stretches its limbs when you tell the apprentice that if the dough rises too fast, you'll recite a boring sermon to slow it down. He says he'll fetch the inspector to read the Assize in a soothing voice. You counter, The mustache alone will make the yeast behave. You both grin at the invisible mustache policing fermentation. Order is a sleep aid. Time to pre-salt the peel, metaphorically speaking. You set the loading board, dust it lightly, test the slide with an empty basket. The door latch on your shop clicks the way it always does, right before someone forgets their coin and remembers their manners. Outside, the town gathers the colour of first light. Inside, your loaves have opinions, and they are mostly agreeable. You feel that quiet bravery that arrives in the hour before oven mouth, a sense that chaos is on your side if you keep your voice low and your movements sure. One last fact, steady as heartbeat. Salt not only seasons, it tightens gluten, reins in fermentation, and helps crust bloom brown. Leave it out, and dough makes bad decisions. You pinch a crystal between finger and thumb and let it dissolve on your tongue. A tiny ocean meeting a small country. The dough rests. You rest beside it, elbows on bench, head tipped as if listening to a secret that keeps telling itself. The bench smells like flour, wood, and patience that paid its rent. When you lift the cloth, your leavened rounds wear the faint, proud lift of something that chose to help. You flour your hands, square your shoulders, and look toward the door that will take you back to the oven's language. Starter fed, sour balanced, salt counted, you have set the sentence. The hearth will add the punctuation. You nod to the sleepy fish stamped in the dough as if to say, behave. It will. So will you. First light doesn't burst. It unbuttons. The bell at St. Bride's lifts a careful note that drifts over roofs and settles on your bench like a blessing you can smell. You answer with palms to dough, a steady press that lengthens muscle and shortens worry. The room is pale now, all corners gentled. Steam from the kettle writes a sentence you could fall asleep inside, if your hands weren't busy convincing flour to remember the shape of bread. You work to the bell's rhythm, push, fold, quarter turn, push, fold, quarter turn, breathing in through your nose, so you can hear the faint hiss of gluten, aligning like threads combed straight. The dough warms under your knuckles, changing from stubborn to companionable. You whisper encouragements you pretend are for the apprentice, but are also for yourself. He pretends not to hear. He always hears. Joke one stretches, yawns, and decides this morning is survivable. Here's your steady fact for the pocket of your apron. Medieval kneading loves the bench and the bowl both. By hand is not nostalgia, it's infrastructure. Recipes, when they bother to be written, give measures in handfuls, mass in the weight of a good apple, and time in bells. You've learned your own constants. The benches spring under your push, the way your sleeve darkens where sweat remembers work, the tiny squeak your left shoulder gives when the dough hits ideal tension. You tell people it's the wood talking. They nod, relieved. You wet your fingers and perform a coil fold, tucking the dough as if it were a quilt on a bed you actually made this morning. Elasticity answers, a soft tug, then a surrender. The apprentice tries the same and invents a new wrestling style called optimistic enthusiasm. You redirect his wrists, and the dough sighs like a cat deciding you are furniture. He grins. Everyone is learning. Quirky tidbit for the walking tour in your head. Some bakers scratch a tiny cross on the dough after kneading, not just to mark it for the communal oven, but to let the devils out, or to invite a blessing to rise along with the yeast. Others prick a single hole with the corner of the bench knife to give the bread a mouth, so it won't burst rudely later. You do both on feast days, neither on weekdays, and explain this inconsistency by saying you're negotiating with metaphors. The dough does not object. You rest the mass beneath a damp cloth and knock your shoulders back until they remember their own width. The bell tolls the next quarter. The town clears its throat. At windows, covers lift. At stables, hay makes promises. At your door, the faintest street draft brushes your ankles like a polite ghost. You deflate, gently pressing out big bubbles so future crumb knows moderation, and the dough subsides with the dignity of a lord taking a lower chair. You can hear your heartbeat in your palms, which feels like a good sign for both of you. Marking next? The apprentice asks, eyeing the stamp with your sleepy fish. Marking next? You say, but first, you divide. Brass weights to one side, knife to the other. You portion with motions that always feel like fair judgment. Clean, quick, equal. Rounds line up like moons in various stages of confidence. You tuck each piece under itself, dragging it on the bench so the skin tightens and the seam smiles shut. Surface tension is a quiet kind of hero, the kind guild bylaws don't mention but every baker praises in private. As you stamp the fish firm press, no wiggle, you add a second mark to the festival loaves. 2 opposed barley slashes, neat and shallow. The blade is sharp as a rumour. You angle it so steam will find the path you offer, and not barge out wherever it pleases. Score too timid, and your crust sulks. Too bold, and it yawns so wide the crumb blushes. You aim for merry, not theatrical. The apprentice tries a flourish that looks like a falcon in need of counselling. You pat his shoulder. Minimalism, you whisper, ASMR soft. He nods, relieved that minimalism is a thing you can declare and then achieve by doing less. Joke 2 sneaks in, wearing a linen cap. Mainstream fact, folded in like salt. Medieval towns often required visible marks on loaves, cuts, stamps, or impressed seals, so that if a batch turned up short, the inspector and his moustache could trace blame to a specific bench. Marked bread is accountability you can eat. Your sleepy fish does double duty. It keeps honest what your scales have already measured, and it gives customers a small joy. Children point at it. Adults pretend they don't. Now you lay palms on each shaped piece to read its mood. A good loaf feels like a held breath that trusts you. You set them in baskets dusted with flour like fresh snow, and check the seam sits up, not down, so gravity will help rather than heckle. You cover them with cloths that still remember yesterday's warmth. Proofing, you murmur, is patience made visible, and patience is the one ingredient your suppliers never try to overcharge. Historians still argue whether bakers in smaller market towns leaned more toward tight crumb paniform loaves or open crumb boules, and whether those preferences came from oven style, grain quality, or fashion drifting along trade roads like a catchy tune. You have opinions, of course you do, but the oven you share and the mouths you feed matter more than any treatise. Today's flour wants a moderately open crumb. The weather agrees. The warden's hearth will provide the rest of the sentence. You set aside a few blessing rolls for the almoner. Same dough, smaller shape, scored with a little cross, not for show but for finding, so the warden can pluck them first. They are currency that buys you exactly nothing and repays you anyway. You also fashion one absurdly tiny loaf a mouse, because the widow with the tired eyes has a grandchild with a laugh you'd like to hear again. The apprentice stamps the mouse with a speck of fish and a wink you didn't teach him. You decide he can stay. While the bench rests, you tend to the little shrine of tools. The lane gets a fresh sliver. The peel gets its edge sanded with a scrap of cloth. The brush loses a few dramatic bristles to the trash. You rub the stamp's face with a smidge of oil so it won't cling to hope or dough. In the corner, a wooden board hangs with carved luck symbols. Wheat, a star, a thumbprint you like to pretend belonged to some ancestor who never lied to a scale. Quirky supplement. There's a folk belief that tapping the bench knife twice before scoring keeps loaves from developing wolf mouth, a ragged overbite where the cut tears wild. You tap twice, mostly because it sounds neat. Joke 3 pads in on soft pause. When you tell the apprentice the inspector's moustache writes letters to the oven at night, asking it to be strict but fair. He counters that the oven's eyebrows reply at dawn. You both stare at the dome in your mind and see eyebrows you cannot unsee. The dough, wisely, declines to comment. The bell murmurs the next quarter. Proof is nearly there. You perform the fingertip, test press, pause, watch the spring, slow return. Yes, you slide a palm under a basket and feel the whole round lift as one creature. The skin has a faint sheen. The seam is sealed like a promise. You dust the top with flour, not for vanity but for contrast, so scores show clean, and the steam can do theatre without drama. Before you go, you draw one more little sign on the bench with 2 fingers, a quiet loop you've traced since your first apprenticeship panic night. It means nothing. It means everything. It's your way of telling the room you'll be back with hot stories and cooler shoulders. You lift a basket and hear that tiny fizz again, the carbonic gossip that says life is ongoing and reasonable. You shoulder the board, adjust the cloth over the loaves, and breathe a sentence long enough to count as rest. In the lane, morning has finally chosen a colour. The air outside tastes like river and chimney and plans. Inside your chest, the calm that arrives when craft and schedule shake hands settles exactly where worry used to sit. The bell hums, you hum back. You move toward the oven with your sleepy fish and your steady hands, ready to write in heat the marks you've already written in touch. Bells loosen the town like laces. First one, thin as a reed, then a fuller bronze voice from St. Bride's, then a brassy show-off from the guild chapel that always rings a fraction eager, like it's being graded. Curfew exhales, shutters blink. A dog edits last night's footprints with new opinions. You hoist your trays, warm rounds, breathing faint steam, and head into lanes that still remember mist. It smells of wood smoke, river, and promise. The loaves add their own weather, malt sweet, nut brown, a comfortable idea rendered edible. Your elbows learn the balancing act again, tray against hip, basket against ribs, peel like a shepherd's staff. The apprentice trots behind with a smaller load, and the swagger of a man who has successfully carried heat without setting himself on fire. Joke one pads along when you tell him to walk like a saint processing with relics. He asks whether the inspector's moustache counts as a relic. You decide it does first class. The gatewatch yawns at his post. Pikestaff planted like a sleepy sunflower. He sniffs and lets dignity loose. That a new flower? He asks, eyes softening into bread worship. You tell him about the blend watermill calm with a hand-quern whisper, then offer him the heel nobody can resist. He bites, closes his eyes, and legislates that today will be reasonable. It's a good law. Mainstream fact tucks its arm in yours. For many medieval towns, the morning bell marked the lifting of the night watch and the opening of gates and market, an audible contract between sleep and trade. In some places, a bangcloche even signalled when ovens and forges could fire, because towns liked their timber houses uncharred. You step in time with that regulation, one bread at a time, proving civilization with crust. The first buyers home in by scent alone, navigated by noses like pilgrim staves. Marjorie materializes out of mist with linen to trade, coins to clink, and gossip to garnish. Same price, smaller loaf? She murmurs, checking weight with the universal test palm tilt and eyebrow measurement. You show her the assize board chalked near your door yesterday. Point out that grain sulk has been democratically applied, and slip her a mouse loaf for the grandchild who laughs like daylight. She pretends not to see, which means she very much does. You set up at your accustomed corner outside the apothecary. Good footfall. Clean stone ledge. Excellent angle on the morning sun when it remembers to arrive. The apothecary himself emerges to smell the air and to claim that cinnamon cures all ills except gossip. You swap a heel for a twig of rosemary for oven spirits, and you both say nothing more in case the rosemary is listening. Quirky tidbit. In some towns, apothecaries kept bread syrups, crumb boiled down into sweet thickeners for the invalid wealthy. In others, bakers sent stale rounds to brewhouses to be reborn as beer. Recycling is older than your broom. Officials drift by in orderly intervals as if their salaries are paid in regular footsteps. The beadle inspects your stamp, sleepy fish lucid on each crown, and offers a curt nod that would be a smile if it weren't salaried. You present the assize loaf, your public sample, and he pinches crumb like a sommelier. Open, even, modest, he declares, which is as close to poetry as his boots allow. You thank his moustache. He refuses to laugh, which is its own joke. A beggar with a city badge stitched to his cloak pauses at the edge of your space. Thin hands, careful eyes. He names himself Joachim, as if offering a receipt, and speaks the ritual line. A crust for St. Bride's poor? You hand him a blessing roll. He answers with the smallest bow and something that might be Latin, or might be gratitude disguised as throat clearing. Municipal alms lists ebb and flow. Your private list stays steady. Anyone who asks while your tray is full is answered by a small bread that keeps its dignity. Historians still argue whether beggars' badges, metal or cloth markers granting licensed mendicancy were widely standardized or mostly local improvisations that looked official from 10 paces. You've seen stamped tin in one market, rough embroidery in another, and once a painted wooden token shaped like a heart that you suspect was more hope than law. Either way, hunger recognizes no seal. You keep your hand open until the tray grows honest gaps. The market ekes into being. A fishwife hums a psalm in the key of herring. A butterwife experiments with prices and innocence. The Fletcher's boy counts arrows and loses. Again. You break the first round with a travelling scribe who insists on paying you with a proverb, and then, seeing your face, adds coin respectfully on top. He writes your sleepy fish into the margin of his ledger, with a flourish that promises immortality for 5 minutes. A friar drifts near, sandals whispering conclusions. He eyes the almoner's bundle you've set aside, and quotes a line about bread and stones. You answer with one about loaves and fishes, then confess you are currently fishless. Except on the stamp, he says, delighted by his own observation. Joke 2 claps politely from a nearby doorstep. You take orders for noon tables and for night shift households, who trade sleep for labour spinners, night watch, a midwife whose yawn could curdle fresh milk if milk weren't so stubborn. You slate their names in flour on a board, because ink at this hour feels like ambition. The apprentice practices change-making, tongue between teeth, brow furrowed into a tidy ridge. You slide him a wink and a coin that you can afford to let him miscount once, A town crier attempts to outring the bells and declares a notice about bridge repairs, which everyone already knew and no one intends to obey. He sniffs your tray, sidles, asks whether official taste testing is a thing. You inform him that the guild recognizes exactly 2 official taste testers, customers and tomorrow. He nods, chastened by philosophy, then buys 2. Mainstream facts keep you nerd company while you trade. Some towns set aside bread lines for soldiers, monks, or palace kitchens, requisitions that bent a baker's schedule like a bow. In London, bakers called white loaves, wastel and cocket, brownfield loaves chate and torte, a taxonomy that made sense to people who never wrote down the parts that confuse you now. You name yours by shape and mood, which customers find easier to love: rounds for comfort, longs for slicing, feast crowns when saints' days demand drama. You angle a tray toward a pair of boys who perform the serious theatre of choosing which loaf will taste most like a story they can eat on the way to errands. They knock the bottoms with knuckles. One says, very grave, hollow means good. You agree and add that too. Hollow means you forgot to press bubbles. Balance is everything. They buy the one with the best ear and split it with surgical precision, then feed the first piece to the street cat who pretends indifference and then fails magnificently. Across the square, a bakehouse rival nods at you with the sharp politeness of a fencer. You nod back. The amicable duel ongoing. Who returns with the emptier tray today? Rivalry keeps your scoring tidy and your patience sharper than your blade. You watch him cut an extra heel for a child and admit the man has taste. The apprentice wonders aloud whether you should have hollered about our corner. You tell him the town is round and corners are a state of mind, quirky to the point of rumour. A passing carter swears some villages judge bread doneness by singing to it, holding a loaf to the ear and humming. If it answers with crackles in the same key, it's ready. You test this, serenading a bool with a bar of a lullaby. It crackles obligingly. The carter's eyebrows applaud. Science. Accomplished. A small commotion by the stocks, nothing grim, just a drunk whose night outran his coin. You consider the almoner's bundle and send a roll via the beadle, who tries to be stern and fails when the roll perfumes his hand with cinnamon rumour. Order and mercy sip the same morning. Do we shout? The apprentice asks as a knot of buyers thickens. We murmur. You say, this is not a fish market. This is a hush shaped like commerce. People come to bread for steadiness. Your voice matches the product. Still, you learn to let the crust sing for you, ears crisp where scores bloomed, a sheen that says, handled with respect. The sleepy fish announcing provenance without bragging. You promise yourself you will never shout the word artisan. You will simply be one. You keep one eye on the sky. Weather writes footfall. If rain hurries, you tilt the tray under an awning. If sun dabs through cloud, you angle your rounds so their glow becomes advertisement. Historians still argue whether the morning crowd in smaller towns skewed toward householders or servants, sent with coins and precise instructions. Your ledger suggests both, plus a category called whoever smelled bread and forgot their plan. By mid-morning, the line thins to a gentle pulse. You count the remaining loaves and feel the pleasant math of enough. A few for the widow, 2 for the miller's dog's owner. You will not ask. 1 for your own breakfast, honestly earned by 7 jokes and 100 quiet kindnesses. The bells soften back into background, their job done for an hour. You tuck coins into the pouch sewn under your apron and find one with a hole drilled through someone's lucky charm that learned a second trade. You slip it on your cord as a talisman against burnt bottoms and dull blades. Joke 3 saunters by when you tell the apprentice to stand up straight. Today you sell bread, not the concept of stooping. He salutes you with the solemnity of a man appointed Vice Minister of Posture. You knight him with the peal. A child claps. The crier rings again, late and earnest. You shoulder the lighter tray and feel the town hum in your bones. Bells, steps, steam, coins, thank yous, the occasional complaint shaped like a compliment. You catch yourself smiling for no theatrical reason. It's the kind of morning that explains why people invented habits, so that good ones could cradle you without asking questions. You turn toward the lane that will return you to the bench, the warden's heat, and the second firing that will taste even better because it arrives after work. The mist finally remembers how to be sunlight. The loaves in your arms remember how to be answers. Market breathes different on its named day stalls, snapping open like fans, scales waking with tiny yawns, voices tuning themselves to prices. You thread your way between trestles and tarps, your empty trays doing double duty as shields and invitations. The air is a stew of butter, fish, apple peel, new rope, old rumours. You don't have to sell right now. You have to maintain the invisible architecture that keeps tomorrow possible smiles, favours, and the kind of arithmetic that happens off ledgers but still balances. The miller is first, because tomorrow's crumb begins under his roof. He stands like an oak that learned to count, hands on hips, cap at an angle that reads, generous if admired. You hail him with a heel from your first firing still warm enough to recommend itself. He noses it like a hound with manners, then bites and chews as if every jaw movement is a negotiation. Even, he decides, which is miller for, you didn't embarrass the river. You thank him and slide toward the subject of grain as if it were a shy cat. Wheat sulked in last week's rain, he begins, offering a price that suggests he believes you were born yesterday, and also in a thunderstorm. You counter with a number that suggests you have lived many yesterdays, and none of them were thunderstruck. He shrugs. You both admire the dance. Joke one clears its throat when you ask whether his millstones have started charging rent. He grins without admitting the grin, and throws in a small sack of bran for your apprentice's courage. That quilt, mainstream fact to set under the store leg, so it doesn't wobble. Many medieval towns had royal or seigneurial charters granting weekly markets and annual fairs rights that brought tolls, stallage fees, watchmen with opinions, and a reliable spine to local trade. Charters were printed in Latin and enforced in human, and they turned a muddy square into a calibrated machine. You feel that machine, keeping time under your boots. You test the miller's sample sack with a quick palm dip. The grain gleams, the smell is clean, the odd kernel nicks your palm with integrity. You ask about the strike, the straight edge he uses to level measures. He produces it like a knight drawing a sword, the rule's edge smooth from 1,000 calm arguments. Quirky tidbit. Some sellers tap 3 times on the rim before striking, a little spell to chase away hollow luck. He taps twice and winks, which is his concession to superstition and to you. You pencil a promise into the air. 2 stones by Wednesday, and he nods, meaning he will try to be Wednesday-shaped. You seal it with a crumb of butter from the next stall, which brings you neatly to Butterwife Joan and her kingdom of yellow. Her pats sit in tidy towers, each stamped with a thistle or a star, so customers can play favourites by constellation. She offers a taste from a wooden paddle, and asks whether you're making feast buns there's been talk about. You reply that your buns don't talk, and if they start, you'll put them in charge of negotiations. Joke too softens her shoulders. She leans in. Prices slide like chess pieces. She complains, cheerfully, about cows that hold grudges. You murmur sympathy and point to your coin pouch, which holds opinions as strong as any cow. A compromise emerges. A lower price if your sleepy fish sits visible on your stall near her butter for a week. You agree. Advertising is just friendship with better lighting. She wraps your pats in damp leaves that smell faintly of meadow and exactly like tomorrow's plans. Out of the corner of your eye you see the fishmongers staking their territory, brine water flashing, scales like thrown coins under the sun that's finally decided to show up. You cross the aisle, inhaling a weather you didn't order. Herring lie in obedient rows. Eels knot themselves into punctuation. You greet old Tom, whose laugh is the public domain. He is brined down to the marrow and happier for it. Fridays write themselves in fish, but today is a Tuesday rehearsing. Tom lifts a herring with grave tenderness. Salted right, he confides, which is fishmonger for worth the coin and the compliments. You buy a string for your own pot and ask whether he'll trade for 2 loaves on St. Clement's feast when the whole quay decides to be pious and hungry. He squints exactly long enough to appear shrewd, then agrees. Trade, here, is a series of small future promises held together by repeated faces. Historians still argue whether urban markets of your scale ran more on coin or on credit tally sticks notched discreetly, promises chalked on door lintels, debts rolled forward like barrels from fair to fair. Your pouch holds pennies with holes and clipped edges. Your head holds lists of who owes you kindness and who owes you nothing. The truth is both. Coin for the day, credit for continuity. You pause at the money changer for a handful of smaller coins, because nothing ruins a morning like the theatre of inadequate change. He counts with a sleight of hand that would shame a conjurer, then sniffs a coin and pronounces it French, as if that explains its moodiness. You do not ask how he can smell national borders. Joke 3 smirks briefly and goes back to sleep. A weaver waves you over with a warp-stained hand, his stall a river of thread. He wants a standing order 2 longs each market day in exchange for cloth at winter prices. You run the fabric through your fingers. It is honest linen with opinions about washing. You accept, because bakers and weavers keep towns from embarrassing themselves. He marks your measure on a tally stick, notches 2 lines, and hands you the debtor half. It slides into your pouch next to your lucky hold penny. Wood and luck greet each other like cousins at a fair. The apothecary, your doorstep neighbour, leans out to request crumbs for a syrup experiment you're not sure anyone sane should drink. You exchange his rosemary pledge for 2 pinches of warming spice he claims is entirely legal. Your eyebrows lift, his do the same. That's how you both agree to pretend nothing happened. Quirky aside, you tuck for later. Some monasteries brew panada, a bread broth for the ill, which tastes like consolation and boiled advice. You'll donate a few stale rounds tomorrow for that noble stockpot. At the grain meter you spy a dispute measure high, strike low. The sergeant of the market arrives, his staff clacking a moderation rhythm. Voices rise, hands flap. Somewhere a chicken decides to contribute philosophy. In the end, the sergeant orders the sack remeasured by God and the strickle, which is the medieval way of saying by tool and theatre. The crowd disperses, satisfied that fairness was seen as well as done. You tack toward the spice seller with his tiny weights and larger stories. He shows you a jar labelled Venice, which is either the origin or the marketing, and offers you nutmeg at a price that suggests each nut grew under a personal blessing. You buy an inch of cinnamon because feast buns deserve a little rumour. He wraps it like a scroll and bows as if you just funded a ship. You accept the bow. It spends like coin. Noon leans, and the crier rings a bell that doesn't belong to him. He proclaims the bishop's permission for butter in Lent by payment, which is to say, if you buy indulgence, you buy pastries. Butter towers will sprout on cathedral facades in centuries you won't see. Today, you note that rich kitchens will want richer loaves, and that poor kitchens will want solace that tastes like fairness. You pencil both into your head where menu meets mercy. On your way back through the fish rows, you overhear a carter explaining that eels make excellent rent when coin runs thin. You believe him because eels look like units of account that got bored and went for a swim. The apprentice asks whether you'll ever accept a salmon for a month of bread. You answer that if the salmon signs its name in clear ink, maybe. He grins and invents a signature with his hand. The salmon, wisely, stays out of it. You stop at the cooper, not for barrels but for a repair to your flour bin. He promises a fitting stave and tells you, unprompted, about a dream where a loaf sang. You tell him about the carter's humming test and he nods, vindicated. This is how folklore travels. On the handles of useful objects. You end where you began, at the miller's eye, which watches the square the way a sailor watches sky. You lift the folded contract you wrote on nothing but conversation and summarize. 2 stones. Wednesday, strike honest. Price with dignity. Bran for bravery. He taps his strike on the edge of the stall twice, which means yes, and also means you will keep each other's names clean. You trade handshakes with the old care of men who lift heavy things. The market softens. A gust topples a stack of rush baskets. 3 people fix it without discussing leadership. A boy with a drum reports there will be mummers after Vespers. The apothecary hopes no one needs him afterward. Your trays, now lined with promises rather than loaves, feel oddly heavier. The town has eaten. Tomorrow is arranged. You angle home through a lattice of smells, and the steady hum that markets leave behind when they've done their job. Satisfaction pretending to be silence. Back at your corner, you chalk quick notes on the board: grain, butter, fish, cloth, spice, cooper, then dust your hands. The apprentice reads it like a catechism. You imagine the second firing, the warden's nod, the evening buyers with their post-market appetites, and the quiet moment you will claim behind the oven with a heel, a smear of butter, and your feet pretending to be furniture. You pack the cinnamon rumour away like a secret you fully intend to share. The bells collect the hour and stack it neatly. You tip your cap to the square, to the charters under your feet, to the arguments that ended in handshakes, and to the small mercies that disguise themselves as discounts. Diplomacy, you decide, is just bread with manners. You've made enough of both to carry you to dawn. The calendar doesn't just hang on a wall. It stands in your flour bin and asks for shapes. Feast days tug your hands into ceremony rounds that wear crosses like quiet crowns, twists that look like braids taught to pray, little crowns that pretend they're angels doing their best. You set the bench for ritual. A deeper bowl, the good linen, the stamp warmed near the hearth so it kisses clean. Cinnamon, rumour and butter promise hover at your elbow like 2 friendly conspirators. You begin with the ordinary dough, then nudge it toward festival bolted flour for grace, a whisper of spice for memory, a touch more sweetness funded by your morning diplomacy with Butterwife Joan. The apprentice watches the measuring with reverence reserved for relics and pastry. He asks, "Do saints prefer softer crumb?" You answer, ASMR low, "They prefer loaves that behave." Joke, one genuflects and sits. Here's your steady fact. In England, Lammas Loaf Mass on the 1st of August saw parishioners bring first fruit loaves to be blessed, a public handshake between bread and altar. Across Christendom, blessed bread shows up under many names, pain bénite, eulogia distributed after Mass or at guild gatherings, reminding everyone that a town is, among other things, a group of people who agree to share warm things. You mark your feast rounds with a cross, not as sermon but as signage, findable for the almoner, recognizable for the warden, legible to the inspector's moustache in case it wants to take notes. You shape crown rounds for the saint who rescued sailors, sheaves plaited for harvest gratitude, and a big town loaf heavier than your usual, scored with barley ears for the guildhall's long table. Your sleepy fish stamp presses lightly beside the holier marks, a humble signature peeking from the margin of a beautiful manuscript. The warden will fuss if he can't track provenance. The saints, you suspect, are fine with footnotes. Quirky tidbit drifts in, spice-scented. A travelling friar swore he'd seen coins baked inside, blessing buns for the poor tiny pennies that clinked when cracked. A surprise alms multiplied by yeast and generosity. You won't hide metal in anything the inspector might bite, but you steal the spirit 2 mice loaves tucked into the almoner's basket, each wrapped with a slip of linen knotted just so, a little treasure hunt of kindness. The apprentice beams like a candle discovering it's useful. You proof the festival batch under linen printed with faint circles from 100 feast days. The cloth smells of soap and parish bells. Out the door, town lopes toward vespers in comfortable shoes. The guild has already chalked a notice. The procession will pause at the bakehouse for customary loaves. Customary is a fancy word for you, and it makes you secretly taller. The warden tests the oven with his signature pinch of flour. It toasts to truth. You load the first crown rounds with a prayer disguised as a steady wrist. Steam rises, and the dome returns your faith in an even brown. The door thunks, heat chews. You count heartbeats and pretend not to. When the first ear opens on a loaf, it looks like a saint listening. Historians still argue whether the crossmark on buns and rounds, beloved emblem of Good Friday in later centuries, was common in your exact era, or blossomed more vigorously post-Reformation as memory and marketing braided themselves. You go on scoring crosses for practical reasons. Steam needs paths and traditional ones, blessing needs places to land. If scholars want to fence with footnotes, you'll feed them afterward. You line finished loaves on the cooling board that creaks like a pew. Crust sings your favourite hymn, Crackle in C sleepy major. Children arrive first, noses leading, hands clasped for show until a parent looks away. You break small pieces, because parable or not, you're a believer in bites that shut small arguments. A bell chases pigeons out of their committee mood. The beadle's wife inspects a crown loaf, declares it decent, and buys 2. Praise, translated into human. The procession gathers candles in their tin cups, guild banners that shed 3 threads per street, singers warming up on a note that can't decide whether it's pious or eager. The guildmaster gives you the look of a man who will pretend he planned your exact quantities. You present the big town loaf. 4 boys heft it like a polite bear. You'd write your sleepy fish on the underside if ink weren't frowned upon in liturgies. Instead, you tuck a wheat ear under the crust edge, your secret signature of sufficiency. Mainstream fact, folded like a gentle turn. Guilds sponsor bread for alms on saints' days, not only for charity, but for public relations, piety baked into policy. Bread buys goodwill with fewer arguments than most other currencies. Your own almoner rounds travel into the crowd by practiced routes. Widows sitting just so. A mason with too many children and not enough stone this month. A washerwoman whose hands look like hard work remembering water. An old woman asks for a loaf, with the luck cut. And you know what she means. A tiny diagonal nip at the heel to invite good news down a road. You do it with a bench knife, twice tapped for wolf mouth, and she blesses you in a dialect that smells like nettle tea and stubborn days. Quirky extra. She tucks a crumb in her pocket, against toothache. A charm halfway between medicine and hope. The apothecary will scowl, but he'll also take your stale rounds tomorrow for panada. So balance stays balanced. Your apprentice is deployed at the corner with a small basket, and orders to trade smiles for coins and coins for alms when a face says more than a purse. He returns with a tally that reads like a stanza. 2 for the mummers, 1 for the crier, none for the goose, rehabilitated, 3 for the matron's bench, 1 for the drunk who sang psalms off-key but with intention. You ruffle his cap, secretly proud that he learned to see need without drawing attention to it. The choir's final amen floats away like steam. The guild banners shiver relief. The warden banks the coals and pretends he wasn't moved. You start the evening batch as the square reassembles into ordinary. Feast bread sold. You pivot to supper loaves a little darker, a little sturdier, because people eat stories at noon and decisions at night. The inspector strolls by as if, accidentally, and accepts a taste for public confidence. He pinches the crumb, nods at the ear, and whispers that his moustache will allow your spice this once. Joke 2 bows and asks for a flourish. You keep a straight face, because dignity is part of the recipe. You remember Lammas and whisper thanks to fields you didn't sow but somehow help harvest. You remember Saint Honoré and give his statue a wooden fellow on a high shelf, a grateful nod for not letting today's batch turn diva. You remember the widow's grandchild and fish out the second mouse loaf, still warm, and deliver it with instructions to squeak before eating. The child obliges with a squeak so committed the street cat files a complaint. A last lad lingers with a copper. For a mark, he says, and points to your stamp. He wants your sleepy fish pressed on his palm. You glance at his mother, who shrugs the shrug of, there are worse tattoos. You dust your stamp with flour and press gently an ephemeral fish, white and giggling, that will last until he discovers puddles. Everyone pretending to be stern fails. Joke 3 does a victory lap. As dusk rinses the roofs, you count coins and quiets. The town looks fed, and the air smells like forgiveness chasing itself slowly around corners. You chalk tomorrow's saint in small letters at the edge of the board, because planning is just hope with handwriting. The apprentice washes the stamp as if it were a chalice. You hang the linen to dry, little ghost circles flapping a benediction over the bench. Before locking up, you set aside 1 crown loaf for the gate watch, and 1 for Joachim with the badge, because faith without logistics is just poetry. You bank your own hearth, so it keeps a motherly warmth for the night. In the hush, you hear the last crusts cooling, that fine sugar shiver of sound that tells you heat is turning into rest. Feast, alms, stamps, songs, public ritual done in crust and crumb. You blow out a candle, and the room agrees. Blessed is work that feeds and remembers. The shop is also a house, and the house is also a school. You run it like a kindly clock. Dough hour, ash hour, teaching hour. The secret 5 minutes when you remember to sip water like a mammal. The apprentices file in with hair damp and eyes optimistic. Your spouse, sharp with lists, soft with burns, has already set the day's common sense on the table with the cups. The peel leans in the corner like a tall uncle who tells 1 good story and 6 warnings. You begin with hands. Palms are for listening, fingers are for editing, you say, guiding the apprentice who kneads like a woodpecker. He slows. Bread rewards slowness the way cats reward furniture. By staying. You show the coil fold again, tuck, lift, lay, and he finally feels the point where dough answers instead of argues. Your spouse watches, arms crossed in satisfaction. You pretend you didn't need the audience to behave. Joke 1 slides out when you whisper. Compliment the dough. Tell it it's doing great. He tells it. The dough miraculously improves. Here is a steady fact to keep near the salt. Apprenticeship contracts, written or sworn, often bound youths for years. 7 was common in many regions by the late Middle Ages, trading labour for skill, board, and the right one day to call themselves of the craft. Masters fed and housed them. Guilds policed bad bargains and bad behaviour. You remember your own indenture. The ink like iron, the handshake like bedrock. The first year mostly sweeping and learning not to cry when steam pinched. You let your charges cry once, then teach them where to stand. The work spreads across the room. Your spouse weighs, tallies, and negotiates order lists with a fluency that keeps tomorrow solvent. You score, load, and pretend the inspector's moustache cannot pass through walls. In truth, marriage is management of heat, coin, expectations. In some towns, a baker's wife may trade in her own name. London lets femmes' souls do business, apart from husbands, at least on paper. In others, coverture swallows signatures whole, and your profits wear another person's hat. Historians still argue whether account books hid women's labour as household help, or whether wives' names, whenever they surface, signal exceptional independence rather than the ordinary truth. You look at the bench. You know what ordinary truth looks like. 4 hands, flour to the elbows, and a ledger that balances because 2 people refuse to blink. Singed wrists happen. You keep a small chest of kindnesses. Honey for a light burn, cool water, linen strips boiled clean, a salve of goose fat and plantain your neighbour swears by. You blow across the apprentice's wrist with the same gravity you use for pricing. Heat teaches, you say, but not too much. He nods, watery-eyed, then tries again with the peel, arms extended, stance wider, dignity intact. Your spouse, passing, taps the bench twice for luck your household's antic to keep Wolfmouth away. Quirky tidbit. A travelling mason taught you to rub a cut onion on a fresh burn, so flames remember their manners. You tried it once and the bread smelled philosophical for a week. You return to honey. Training is choreography disguised as chores. One apprentice whisks ashes from the oven floor with the quick wet mop that tames stray embers. Another slings sacks in a tidy arc that spares the back and impresses the cat. You assign rotations so no one becomes a specialist in boredom. The new boy learns bench whisper first, the patience to watch proof rather than force it. The older one gets promoted to door, which means he learns the sacred timing of thump open, peak, and the fatal pause that ruins crust. You put him on a metronome. The bell tower's quarter strokes set the check rhythm. When in doubt, you murmur, ask St. Bride's. He salutes the window like a soldier in love with punctuality. Joke 2 raises a flowery eyebrow and approves. Your spouse runs the counter-diplomacy, calm with hats, decisive with coins, affectionate with regulars, steel with short-weight accusations. The guild allows wives to sell, and some bylaws even expect them to. Bread is a household enterprise as much as a craft. Children come to her hand before yours. Buyers confess inventory needs they wouldn't admit to a ledger. You marvel, privately, at how many crises end when your spouse says, at the correct volume. If guild charters are the bones, this is the cartilage. Mainstream fact to hang by the door. In some cities, bakers separated into white and brown fraternities. London kept distinct companies for fine flour wafers and household loaves well into the early modern period, each with its own ordinances, seals and ceremonies. You bake mostly brown with grace, white on saints' demands. Your shop sits where the Venn diagram becomes breakfast. The apprentice asks if he can be both. You tell him to be useful. He beams the better title. The law visits even when it isn't wearing boots. You teach by statute as much as by touch. The assize weight, the penalty for false measure, the obligation to keep your peel short of a neighbour's nose at the communal mouth. You mention night regulations. Some towns forbid late baking for fear of fire. Others demand it so morning crowds don't bite each other. Historians still argue whether bans were enforced or merely posted for conscience. You self-enforce by sleeping with one ear open and your hearth sensibly banked. Your spouse enforces by noticing when your stubbornness tries to impersonate bravery. You keep morale with little ceremonies. The first ear award goes to the loaf, whose score springs prettiest. The winner gets the heel with butter and the right to ring the little bell that says, load. The clean bench ribbon, actually a faded strip of linen, hangs above whoever sweeps best. You jokingly threaten to summon the Guild of Groans if puns deteriorate. The apprentices redouble their efforts, which tragically makes the puns worse. Joke 3 bows deeply, trips on the ribbon, recovers, and whistles off stage. Wives and apprentices share a language of glances. A tilt toward the door means haggle incoming. A finger's rest on the ledger means round up. They always forget farthings. A lowered chin means the widow first. You work within this grammar, like musicians who finally learned each other's favourite key. When the inspector arrives, your spouse produces the assize loaf before his moustache even finishes entering. When the miller sends word of a late cart, the apprentice extends proofing by one gentle fold, and the house sighs in time. Quirky observation. You have a bread saint clutter shelf pegs, holding odd survivals of the trade. A scorched peel tip that looks like a crescent moon. The first sleepy fish stamp you carved, lopsided and loved. A coin with a hole that refused to buy anything and therefore bought luck. The apprentices dust it daily. Your spouse rolls eyes, dusts it again, and secretly straightens the lopsided stamp so the fish swims true. Discipline lives here too, but it wears slippers. Lateness earns the ash bucket. Boasting earns a blindfold on the bench knife drill slice flour line straight by feel while the room tries not to laugh. Waste earns the porridge shift, turning stale scraps into staff meal panada until humility thickens. Praise, on the other hand, is public and specific. Your scoring today made steam civilized, you say. Your change-making turned chaos into arithmetic. Your spouse adds, apprentices grow taller at sentences like those. Evenings, you sit together over accounts, the page a treaty between day and future. The apprentice traces columns with a cautious finger. Your spouse points out that charity also belongs on the line. It's a cost and a choice, and both deserve ink. You add it, the ledger looks handsomer for the honesty. Outside, the warden rakes and the square trades gossip for dusk. Inside, you talk winter. Wood stacks, barley grudges, a rumour that the bishop will permit butter in Lent by payment again. You plan quietly, which is to say, you breathe. You think about the craft passing forward. One day an apprentice will leave, shoulders squared by your bench, hands ruined in the way that means they're perfect. Maybe he'll marry into a shop. Maybe she'll inherit a corner stall that becomes a corner story. You'll get a heel wrapped in cloth on market day with a note. I stamped the fish on the backside for luck. You'll show your spouse and pretend not to tear up into the butter. Before bed, you check the mother leaven, your house elder humming along in her bowl. The apprentice folds a clean cloth over her, careful as a novice with relics. Your spouse snuffs the last candle and leaves the good one ready in case of eyebrows oven, inspector, or fate. The room goes lavender dark. In that hush, the roles baker, spouse, apprentice settle into one braid. Skill, learning, patience, patience teaching law, law making room for kindness. Tomorrow we'll ask for all three again. You will answer with the same small exact gestures. A stamp, a fold, a nod at the ledger, a hand on a singed wrist that says, "You're doing fine." Some mornings the oven wakes on the wrong side of its bricks. You feel it in the way the draft sulks, in the way the warden's peal makes a sound like instead of ah. You're ready for it. Every baker keeps a little kit of mercy for when heat forgets its manners. The first batch comes out with bottoms a shade too ambitious, the colour of monk's sandals after pilgrimage. You thump a loaf. It answers in baritone. Not ruined, just opinionated. Salvage begins. You tip each guilty loaf and shave its base with the bench knife held flat. A carpenter of crust, sending thin black curls to the pig bucket, where even mistakes become bacon someday. You rub the cut with a clean cloth. A little smoke smell lingers, which some customers claim is sophistication, and others call market authenticity. You label it honest morning and keep moving. Quirky tidbit the old warden taught you. Cabbage leaves laid briefly on a scorched heel. Lift some bitter, as if brassicas moonlight as sponges. You try it when a loaf acts especially theatrical. The apprentice watches the leaf steam and declares it magic. You nod gravely and tell him all cuisine is vegetables for giving fire. Joke one bows. The next mischief is a slack round that sighs itself wider than you intended. A puddle with aspirations. Overproofed by a whisper, you know exactly which conversation distracted you. The apothecary's rosemary conspiracy. You corral it with a band of folded linen, then decide it will become trenchers, the edible plates you sell to the tavern. Mainstream fact for your ledger of rescues. In many medieval households and taverns, stale or sturdy bread served as trenchers, soaking gravies before passing sometimes literally into arms after the meal. Nothing learns humility like gravy. The oven itself begins to mutter. A hairline crack in the crown, you think, or a soot patch that refuses to surrender. You tap the dome with the warden's iron and listen. It answers like a bell with a cold. The warden shifts the fire. You fetch the wet mop and draw quick circles on the floor, cooling a hot patch that's burning bottoms while the rest lingers. The technique saves the next round. The floor goes from vengeful to firm. You hang the breadboard over the door, a carved plank etched with wheat, star, and your sleepy fish, a talisman and a message. Heat behaves here. Plenty of shops keep one, half superstition, half signboard. A carter swears the board steals sparks before they can leap to thatch. You don't test this by experiment. You simply trust the quiet way customers look up at it, and then at you, reassured. A breeze bullies down the flue and pushes smoke into the room. The apprentices cough. Your spouse opens the high shutter a hand's width. You recite the little rhyme that says smoke listens to politeness better than to orders, because it's either that or explain pressure differentials before breakfast. The smoke considers. It thins just enough for you to see the peel again. Joke 2 clears its throat, then decides not to make a joke about flu season. You are growing. You keep a bucket of sand by the hearth and a pail of water by the door, your private treaty with risk. Here's a steady fact that lives in bylaws and bells. Many medieval towns enforced fire ordinances, curfews that literally meant cover the fire, from the old French couvre-feu, communal ovens in lieu of private ones, and fines for chimneys that performed like dragons. A bell at night told households to bank embers under ash. Inspectors checked thatch and insisted on ladders. You listen for that bell even in daylight. Caution is a habit you'd like to outlive you. Historians still argue whether the curfew bell chiefly regulated fire safety or performed broader duties. Policing street life, structuring nights, reminding everyone that town belongs to quiet after a certain hour. Either way, you cover your coals at dusk with the same care you uncover them at dawn. Your roof prefers history without flames. A loaf pops at the ear with a crack like a rude laugh, and tears past your tidy score, the dreaded wolf mouth. You tap the bench knife twice your household's anti-wolf superstition, and trim the jagged bit to save the crumb from dryness. You place rescued slices in a bin for sops, bread floated in broth, wine or ale, to feed folks who need soft edges. Your almoner knows the route to those mouths. Bread mistakes make good soup. A child at your counter asks why one loaf sits upside down cooling. You wince caught out. In parts of France there's a superstition against that. An overturned loaf is said to be reserved for the executioner, or else it invites bad luck to sit down and stay. Historians still argue whether that story's roots are medieval practice or a later tale that stuck because it's tidy and dramatic. You write the loaf anyway. No sense inviting grim visitors or scaring children with career counselling. The inspector arrives, moustache already composing a report. He pinches a salvaged bottom, raises one eyebrow in a parabola that could carry water, and waits. You present the honest explanation, hot patch, wet mop, corrected load, and the honest redemption trencher duty for the slackers, alms bin for the trim, next batch adjusted. He grunts exactly once, a sound that translates to systems work. You offer him a heel from a perfect ear. He declines, then remembers he is human, and accepts. Joke 3 tiptoes by imagining his moustache signing for the sample. Your spouse posts a neat note. Today's heels for sops. Customers nod. The town has eaten enough bluster to appreciate frankness. Marjorie of the linen stall brings a scrap for binding burns. Butterwife Joan sends a pat for morale. You wonder, not for the first time, how much of safety is built from guild charters, and how much from neighbours refusing to let a morning slide downhill. Superstitions creep in with kindness. The old mason who mended the oven crown once told you to tuck a small iron nail under the sill to quiet the little spirits who chew the mortar. You smiled, then did it, because silence is a fine foreman and nails are cheap. Another baker swears by tracing a cross with the peel on the oven mouth before the first load. You salute the dome with the peel not because bricks need sacraments, but because your shoulders remember confidence when they repeat the gesture. A runaway spark freckles your forearm. You hiss, then laugh at yourself for anthropomorphizing embers. Honey, cool water, bandage. The apprentice flinches as if burns travel by sympathy. You assure him they don't only care does, so he'd better pass that along instead. He fetches the sand bucket closer and sets it by the door without being asked. You make a note to praise him when the room isn't listening. Mid-morning, the warden's rake catches on something, and the oven door balks. You and he work the hinge with patient cussing, the kind that barely counts because it's in service of order. The door relents. You grease the pin with a dab of fat, and the ritual whisper every baker knows. Be good now. The door, flattered, behaves. You triage a dozen little crises. A loaf that refuses to free itself from a basket solved with a brush of flour and a stern stare. A peel splinter solved with a knife, and a vow to sand it before sleep. A draught that keeps waltzing past the shutter, solved by a rolled cloth against the sill like a gentle barricade. No drama, just choreography. By noon, the shop smells like victory pretending to be routine. A customer returns around with a frown, too dark for my stew, and you swap it with a lighter one and a sincere apology. The dark loaf goes straight to the tavern where they like crustier sops. Coin doesn't vanish. It changes costumes. Your ledger will nod tonight, and your sleep will feel less like negotiation. Between firings, you touch the breadboard above the door, the carved wheat polished by years of nervous palms. You know charm from craft, but you let them share a hook. The board looks back like a witness who never tattles. You plan to sand it next fair day, oil it with walnut, remind the symbol to shine in case symbols do in fact influence bricks. Evening leans in. The second firing glows exactly the colour you wished for all morning. You pull a loaf that sings like a choir forgiving a soloist. The apprentice taps its bottom and grins. Your spouse eyes the crumb and declares the day salvage plus surplus. You count the alms bin. full enough to feed need, empty enough to prove your morning didn't go to waste. Before banking the coals, you sweep the hearth as if sweeping were an oath. Sand in its bucket, water in its pail, nail under the sill, cabbage retired with honour, bench knife tapped twice for the wolf you kept outside. You set tomorrow's kindling, lay the damp cloth over the mother leaven, and thank the room out loud. Maybe superstition, maybe manners. Either way, the bricks seem to settle, a cat's contented thrum in stone. You hang the peel where it watches the door like a tall uncle again. You blow out the lamp and hear the crusts cooling tiny clicks like distant rain on slate. The town's curfew bell will speak soon. You'll cover your hearth and count your lucks. Neighbours, sand, cabbage, jokes that didn't burn, and a moustache that accepted a heel. Not every day resists mishap. Not every mishap resists mercy. You lock the door, feeling not triumphant so much as rehearsed, and rehearsal is what keeps wooden towns from learning fire the hard way. You hitch the cart before dawn, and aim your wheels at a road that remembers hooves better than it remembers good intentions. Sometimes the smartest way to improve a loaf is to go sniff someone else's. You tell the apprentice that travel is just kneading with feet. He groans, which is proof of life. Your spouse slips you a pouch of coins, 2 blessing rolls for the road, and a look that says, "Don't trade the cart for cinnamon." You promise to only trade it for excellent cinnamon. Joke one waves from the gate like a polite stowaway. Frost paints the ruts with thin sugar. Crows open the morning with commentary that sounds suspiciously like market gossip. You cross the river at the Miller's Bend and tip your cap to the wheel, tamed thunder still beating its circles. Mainstream fact to tuck in your travel cloak. By the high Middle Ages, watermills dotted landscapes across Europe, but windmills rose with real swagger in the Low Countries, and England from the late 12th, 13th centuries onward, spinning grain into flour where rivers sulked or froze. You plan to see one if the weather stops rehearsing for Lent. The first town stirs under a ridge like a cat rolling over. You drift to the bakehouse by nose, same as at home, a warm, brown compass. The warden here wears a cap shaped like a very serious mushroom. His peel is shorter than yours, and his oven mouth arches wider, as if the town speaks in vowels. You greet him with the professional nod, chin down, eyebrows cooperative, and offer one of your blessing rolls in exchange for a peek at his hearth. He obliges, because bakers recognize the holy order of curiosity. His floor is chalked in a neat lattice guidelines for loading patterns, so each family's mark sits where memory can find it. Your sleepy fish would look handsome on that grid, you think. Quirky tidbit. He keeps a little whistle carved from bone to signal phases. 1 tweet for load, 2 for turn, 3 for admire. The apprentices here move like trained swifts. You whistle back, 1 short note of appreciation. He grins. Professionally. You ask after grain. He shows you sacks labelled not just by mill but by field. North Lear, Abbey Close, Gaffer's Hill, and he swears he can taste the hedge in a crumb. You chew one of his heels, and you almost believe him. The flour feels rounder, softer, a field that learned civility. He mixes old dough leaven with a spoonful of balm, a hybrid you love and your apprentice calls interfaith bread. You make a note. When brewing's busy at home, invite a ladle of froth. When brew is thin, let Mother Leaven sing solo. Guild rules hang by the door, written in a careful hand that looks like it charges by the curl. Their assize matches yours in spirit, but not in arithmetic. Loaf names differ, weights measured against a local standard weight stone that looks like it could anchor a cathedral. Bring your weights next time, the warden says. Let's see whether our moustache and yours argue. He means inspectors, plural, in the way people mean weather, plural. You promise a return trip with brass. Somewhere far off, an official moustache sneezes. The road shouldered, you bump along to a market town with a windmill pricking the horizon like a quill in a giant's inkwell. It hums a dry song. A boy named Pieter explains how they angle the sails and reef the cloth when the wind shows off too much. Inside, the mill stinks gloriously of oil, wood, and stubbornness. Stones turn with a rhythm you can nap to. The miller's thumb here is appropriately legendary. You ask to test a handful. The meal is cool, friction gentled by breeze rather than river. Push finer in a way that feels like silk pretending to be snow. Your mind leaps to feast buns, and the inspector's eternal pinch test. Good luck, moustache. Spelt? You ask, eyeing a bin. Rivet, he says, pointing to a redder wheat that bakes a bold crust and a dense loyal crumb. Historians still argue whether medieval references to spelt in some English records actually meant rivet wheat, a a hard variety, misnamed by clerks who were better at Latin than at lunch. You buy a sack of the red stuff to invite that argument to your bench. Worst case, you'll invent a new loaf and name it diplomatically. You sit on the mill sill and eat your second roll with a slice of local cheese so fresh it still remembers the cow's opinion. A carter says his aunt tests wheat by biting a kernel and listening, claiming good grain cracks like truth. You try, hear something that might be honesty, and pretend your teeth aren't filing a grievance. Joke 2 circles its wagons and sets up camp. Midday brings you into a town that prides itself on fairness. Loudly toll posted big, market dues clear, a sergeant whose staff boasts more notches than your tally stick. Their guild keeps stranger rights. You may sell at an outer stall but not poach regulars, may use the oven at third firing, must present one sample loaf for public fondling. You comply with good grace and a better smile. Your sleepy fish, stamped on a trial loaf baked at dawn, charms 2 children and 1 alderman, who confesses he once overweighed buns so he could claim generosity. You tell him the baker's dozen exists for exactly that impulse. He blushes into honesty and buys 13. At the communal oven, marks bloom you've never seen. A ladder, a fish hook, a crowned heart, a very convincing turnip. You press your fish lightly to a scrap of dough as a visiting calling card. A woman shows you how she scores a long loaf with a bishop's staff curve for feast days. You trade your barley ears mark in return. Bread is a language. Today you learn 2 new letters. Mainstream fact hums again. Staple rights in some cities force traders to unload certain goods at designated markets, channeling grain to official scales and tolls. Here, the grain meter strikes clean. The strike bar has a tiny brass inlay to keep the edge honest. You want one, and immediately begin to plot how to convince your miller that brass inlay is the difference between good and immortal. You talk ovens. This town's crown is a hair shallower, baking quicker top heat. Cabbage leaves feature here too, but for steam rather than rescue. A baker lays one on the sill to scent the mouth and claim the next slot. Secretly ridiculous, publicly adorable. You resist switching allegiances from rosemary. The warden lets you test with his peel. You load 2 visiting rounds and discover his door wants a sharper, faster thump. You oblige. The loaves spring with ears like men who just heard their names praised in a tavern. On the road again, you trade a heel for directions to a farmhouse where they grow rye that doesn't mope. The farmer's wife snorts at the idea of non-moping rye and sells you a sack with a wink. She mentions ergot like a neighbour you avoid at weddings. You nod soberly and check the heads, dark kernels banished with day labour and a gossipy eye. You pocket a pinch to examine under your best daylight. Your apprentice, riding the cart tail, keeps a tally of jokes he will deploy when you inevitably say rye and rye in the same sentence. You pretend you won't. Evening finds you at an inn where the trenches are sound, the ale mild, and the room full of men who believe their dogs understand Latin. You pay with coin and half a loaf. The innkeeper presses you for a recipe, and you quote your favourite instruction: knead until the dough looks like it owes you money. Laughter tucks around you like a blanket. On the wall hangs a pretzel painted on wood, the twist tidy as a prayer. The brewer swears his grandmother said the shape was arms folded in piety. His wife insists it's simply the best way to hang them on sticks for drying. You hang your shrug with your cloak and accept both. Quirky lodging custom. The baker's bed gets extra ash-warmed bricks on cold nights. An old courtesy for the guild that keeps mornings from getting ugly. You accept the bricks and imagine the inspector's moustache lying on the next pillow, snoring judgment. Sleep arrives anyway, because you walked as if work were a place and not just a bench. Morning returns with its usual lack of consent. You swing through one more village and find a hand-quern circle where women grind and trade gossip, stones singing a thin, stubborn music. You offer to turn a few rounds and get laughed at in a kindly way. You turn anyway, calibrating your shoulder to their pace, and admit silently that this flour, warm and coarse, carries a house's voice. You buy a little for blending. Your hands already know which customer wants this honesty, and which wants something closer to silk. On the last stretch home you inventory your spoils. Rivet wheat for bold crusts, rye that promises to behave, a scribbled spice seller's address that may or may not be Venice, a brass inlay idea, a whistle you did not buy because you respect your spouse's nerves, 2 new scoring marks, and a rumour that a town eastward keeps a black bread of barley, oat, and stubbornness you must taste before you die. Also a cabbage leaf from a warden who insisted you take the luck with you. You tuck it near the stamp. Your cart smells like bakery, ambition, and road dust. You roll into your lane like a returning ship. The warden waves his peel. Your spouse lifts an eyebrow that asks for receipts and gets, instead, a heel from the windmill's flour with butter that butterwife Joan would admire. You unload sacks, telling stories while your hands lift. The apprentice cradles the red wheat like a baby owl. You set one sack against the bench and feel tomorrow change shape. Historians still argue whether techniques travelled more by journeymen wandering under guild letters, or by market osmosis, housewives trading notes, millers bragging across wheels, bakers lying modestly about ovens at fairs. You're content with the simplest truth. You went, you saw, you tasted, you asked decent questions, and then you came home with better ideas than you left with. The road needed you. Your bench will rise from it. You rinse the cart wheels, hang the harness, and press your sleepy fish into a fresh dough like a friend you haven't seen since yesterday. The oven mouth opens, generous as a yawn. You feel the town's appetite slide into place, familiar and grateful. New grain, old hands, same bell. You tap the bench knife twice, wolf-proofing by tradition, tuck the cabbage charm above the sill, and grin at the room. Travel was good. Bread will be better. The moustache can come see for itself. The weather forgets its job sometimes. Rains stack like badly kept ledgers, or frost sneaks back after spring has promised better manners. And suddenly grain behaves like a moody noble present. Expensive, unreliable. You feel it first in the hush at market, the way hands linger over loaves, as if performing arithmetic by touch. Then butterwife Joan starts talking hedge recipes, and the miller polishes his strike like a man preparing to argue with God. You tighten your apron and audit your shelves. Flour lower, brown higher, beans blinking at you from the corner, like understudies who never expected to go on. You start where honesty starts, naming what the dough can handle. Wheat gives way to blends, maslin with rye. Horse bread mixes with peas and beans milled fine. Stretch it, your spouse says, meaning stretch the grain without cheating the town. You put the brass weights on the bench like chaperones and begin the careful business of resilience. Mainstream fact to anchor your night. During hard years, think the Great Famine of 1315, 1317, across parts of northern Europe, towns leaned on substitutes and charity. Guilds enforced the assize with grim patience. Households mixed peas, beans, oats, even barley into loaves so tables stayed tables and not stories about hunger. Prices rose, loaves shrank, alms lists lengthened. Your craft becomes less about perfect ears and more about honest math that doesn't break anyone's teeth. You lay peas on a cloth and sort out the stones with the speed of experience. The hand quern returns to the centre of the room, its music thin and dutiful. You grind beans to meal, sift out peels, then blend with rye to coax a crumb that can still remember softness. The apprentice wrinkles his nose. You tell him flavour has a learning curve. He replies, his nose has opinions. Joke one salutes both. Acorns arrive because a forester friend owes you a favour, and because trees are surprisingly good at keeping receipts. You crack, shell, and leach them boil. Change water, boil, change water, until the bitterness resigns like a stubborn official outlived by paperwork. Quirky tidbit. Some households swear by running leached acorn meal through a stream in a tied cloth overnight. It teaches the tannins humility, your friend says, deadpan. You try the bucket method instead. The stream is busy being picturesque, while the pot mutters. You assemble the leaning loaf, your famine formula, a base of rye and barley, a measure of pea meal for protein and stubbornness, a respectful pinch of sour from the mother to persuade texture, and a little oil if the almoner can spare it. Score simple, bake hot, teach expectations to sit. These loaves won't sing like feast crowns. They will, however, keep heads clear and hands steady, which, tonight, counts as a hymn. Historians still argue whether horse bread, bean and pea loaves, often fed to servants and actual horses, sat on human tables by necessity during the worst years, or whether the terminology muddles class and menu beyond. Recognition. You don't need the footnote to know what hunger does to vocabulary. You stamp the sleepy fish anyway. Pride is also a nutrient. You post a sign with prices that make your stomach feel like a badly tied knot, and a second sign with what you'll give away, small rounds stamped with a barley ear. First come, first fed, no questions, no sermon. The inspector arrives with mustache grave and ledger open, then surprises you by helping carry baskets to the parish door. Assize holds, he says, but mercy travels faster. You pretend not to hear the sentence chin quiver underneath his regulation tone. The oven needs adjustments for this new dough. It prefers urgency. You give it one extra mop, a hotter floor, shorter patience. First batch comes out respectable. The crust matte rather than glossy, the crumb tight but yielding to a properly determined tooth. You thump and hear a note like a low bell, the sound of a loaf that knows why it exists. The apprentice chews thoughtfully and declares it honest. You think of inscribing that on the door. Marjorie of the linen stall stops by with a barter scraps that can bind wounds in exchange for 2 leaners. She notes the acorn rumour and tells you her grandmother swore by chestnut meal as a cousin to flour in places where chestnuts were less gossip and more economy. You file it under, if the wind pushes us there. The friar drifts through with a bag that looks lighter than sermons and takes 6 for alms, leaving a blessing that sounds like a recipe. Patience, heat, salt, and neighbours. You institute a crumb pot on the counter bits from shaved bottoms. Yesterday's heel, the ugly ducklings that cooling made honest. You simmer them with onions, garden leaves, and the apothecary's cleanest advice into a panada that tastes like survival remembering its manners. Families bring mugs. You ladle. The room warms with the sound soup makes when it talks people into tomorrow. Joke 2 peaks up when you warn the apprentice that if he oversalts, the bishop will personally revoke his ladle privileges. He salutes as if the bishop were hiding in the flour bin. There's a practical tenderness in scarcity. You slice with thinner confidence. Wrap loaves in cloth that whispers reuse. Ask buyers whether 2 smalls will do in place of 1 grand. Many nod. Some hesitate. A few try to haggle with fear in their eyes. You add a small roll to those bags and look elsewhere while dignity finds its hat. Your spouse keeps a second ledger labelled when better, with names and amounts that the future will repay or forget without poison. Scholars still debate whether the famine's teeth were climates or policies: too much rain, too little foresight, poor storage, bad roads, worse tolls arguing over ratios no hungry person ever weighed. You participate in the only argument you trust. Oven settings, blends that don't crumble, cues that don't bruise. The warden lets your third firing slide forward because he recognises the way your shoulders slope. Even officials own spines that remember being human. You try a chest of hunger cakes flat, quick bakes of oat, pea meal, and a kiss of oil pressed thin on heated stones when wood runs dear. They're not bread, but they're not nothing, and children accept them with the seriousness of diplomats. Quirky superstition for the minute. The old mason swears if you score a tiny ladder on a lean loaf, luck will climb down into it. You grant a dozen little ladders their chance. A rumour travels faster than carts. A granary wagons in from 2 towns over under guard. The queue tightens. You shut the shop early and walk to the square to help measure at the public strike 1 scoop, 1 straight edge, 1 level eye. Sir Plus and Lady Minus try to attend. You send them home. The sergeant marks sacks. The crier reads out names. You call the next family forward and pretend the air is warmer than it is. Mainstream fact. Steady as your hand. In many places, councils fixed maximums a household could buy and reserved a portion for the poor at controlled prices. Rationing as policy instead of rumour. You admire that when it works, and work around it when it doesn't. Your alms bin acting as a shadow ration that never learns accounting but knows justice by smell. Night returns with a thin moon, and thicker worries. You make lists by candle, blends that worked, buyers who need a knock at the door if they don't show. The cart route to the farmer with rye that refuses to mope. You also make a joke list because laughter is cheaper than cinnamon. Ban Inspector Mustache from soup. Teach acorns table manners. Pet cabbage leaf for luck. Joke 3 pats the bench and lies down. You bank the coals with extra care. Towns in tight years burn faster in every sense. The curfew bell sounds muffled, as if even bronze understands restraint. The mother leaven gets a careful feed. She bubbles with the kind of optimism that doesn't read headlines. You cover her and wish for a week of boring weather. Before sleep, you write a small note to yourself and tuck it under the breadboard charm. Keep the crumbs soft where you can. Keep the rules honest where you must. Keep the hand open. You imagine future mornings reading it and feel your shoulders unhunch a fraction. In bed, you and your spouse talk logistics and mercy until the words slow into breath. The apprentice's snores from the loft sound like a hand quern that has decided to be a lullaby. Tomorrow you'll grind more peas, leach more acorns, argue kindly with barley, and stamp the sleepy fish on loaves no one dreamed of loving until they had to. It isn't the bread you choose, but it's the bread that keeps doors polite and tempers domestic. You fall asleep, counting loaves turned into bowls, turned into neighbours who will, with luck, turn back into laughter. You learn as much at your doorway as on the road. Travellers bring crumbs of other hearths stuck to their sleeves, and you shake those sleeves gently until recipes fall out. Tonight the square is a translation engine. A merchant from the Levant, with jars that smell like a wedding. Two sailors who claim to have baked flatbreads on overturned shields. You raise an eyebrow. They swear by it. A pilgrim with dust in his beard and sesame in his pockets like polite confetti. You light a second lamp over your bench. Hospitality doubles as research. You begin with Flower's first mirror, the sieve. The merchant unfurls a bolt of horsehair cloth so fine it hums when he plucks it. He calls it saf, then shrugs and calls it very good. Your own linen and silk do fine work, but this net looks like it could catch moonlight. You trade a feast crown for a square and try it on a test bowl. The meal snowfalls with a softness your fingers call poetry. Quirky tidbit drifted with the cloth. He insists his grandmother judged a sieve by how well a cat could sleep on it without falling through. You do not test this, because your cat's opinions are already a full-time job. Mainstream fact paces alongside the spice jars. Long routes, overland caravans, and Mediterranean hulls have braided cinnamon, cloves, black pepper, and sesame into European kitchens since late antiquity, waxing and waning with wars and taxes. By your era, merchants and apothecaries make a living translating that fragrance into feast days. You pinch a seed and taste sun. Sesame whispers crust. And suddenly you can see it. A winter loaf rolled in pale seeds like a breaded moon. The inspector's moustache twitching in surprise. And then, maybe, approval. The sailors tell you about hardtack. Those teeth-testing boards that keep men floating and complaining in equal measure. You nod. You've baked sops and trenchers and know the line between sturdy and punitive. But one sailor grins and describes shield bread on ship decks, in still water iron warmed, thin dough slapped, blistered flat and devoured with brine and bravado. You try something safer. A hot tile in your oven mouth, a thin round rolled from your own dough, a quick flip with the small peel. It puffs like a boast that turned true, then settles into a soft disc. You brush it with oil the apothecary swears is culinarily acceptable, rub a clove of garlic across it like good news, and salt it with a pinch that forgot to be expensive. The apprentice bites and makes the face of a man discovering geography. A pilgrim shows you the palm press trick he learned in a monastery guest house. Wet palms, press dimples across a round before baking. The little wells hold oil and herbs and keep the top from ballooning, the way some breads eastward prefer a polite flatness. You press, drizzle, scatter rosemary, your oven spirit friend, and bake near the door for gentler heat. The top emerges with golden eyes. The shop smells like a hillside that studied manners. Joke one pads by when you announce, "This is bread for people who like their poetry edible." The sailors approve as if you just named a ship. Trails also carry timing. A wiry man with a drum, he calls it a daff, keeps time for mummers, and it turns out, for dough. He shows you how to tether folds to beats. 4 slow, 6 quick, rest on the rim, repeat. Your shoulders learn a new choreography, and the dough answers with an even breath as if music calibrated its memory. You're not about to replace bells with drumskins, but you tuck the rhythm under your sleeve for winter mornings when the town forgets how to count. The apprentice practices on the flour sack. Your spouse confiscates the drumstick before it becomes a house pet. Joke 2 nods sympathetically to the confiscated beat. A scholar ink on nails, parchment on breath, tells you about a Moorish treatise where cooks perfume dough with mastic and scatter nigella for blessing. He argues footnotes at your counter while you measure with your hands. Historians still argue whether diaspora and conquest move recipes faster than trade alone, or whether households, quietly curious, do most of the carrying by copying flavours they liked at feasts. You decide not to decide. You try the seed nigella, black and shyly peppery on a test boule. It bakes into tiny stars, fragrant without shouting. The inspector's moustache raises 1 respectful millimetre. You adapt the oven mouth too. A traveller from far north sketches with a charred stick on your sill. Bank heat hard, then bake long with the door sealed by a wet rag to trap steam. "Our winters bake this way," she says. "Let your crust learn patience." You test on 1 boule, rag pressed, door wedged tight with the cabbage leaf's grown-up cousin, a damp wad that squeaks. The crust returns deeper, the ear a measured arc. You imagine winter finding you with new tools rather than old excuses. Sesame rolls charm the market at first light. The pilgrim's dimples become blessing eyes because the friar can't resist branding. The drummed folding, used quietly, evens the texture on a day when your mind sprints ahead of your hands. You keep notes in the ledger's margin that only you can read. A dot for sesame, a tiny ladder for sealed steam loaves, a fish with a crown for the dimples. Your sleepy fish stamp swims happily through the new sea. Quirky fringe floats in with a peddler's grin. He sells a clay pot he calls a traveller's oven, 2 bowls that seal to trap heat, meant for hearth ash baking. You test with a handful of dough on the bench, tucking the pot into your ash bed like a hen. It emerges with a crust. Unlike your domes, a little soft, a little smoke-kissed, the crumb delicate as a confession. Not for bulk, but for late nights when the communal mouth sleeps and you owe someone a warm goodbye. You label the pot good for secrets. You swap rye tricks with a monk who once kept an oven in a hillside priory, his sour a decade deep. He suggests a scald pour boiling water over a handful of rye. Cool, then blend, sweetens the crumb, he promises, and makes winter less argumentative. You try it and taste how starch transforms, a caramel murmur under the usual tang. You make a note. Scald on cold mornings, especially when barley sulks. The apprentice declares it wizardry. You, being practical, agree. Mainstream fact stretches its arms. Paper recipes stay rare, so techniques migrate by mouths and wrists. You imagine a map not of borders but of gestures. How a fold you learned from a drummer meets a score you traded for in a town with a wider dome. How sesame from a jar that sailed becomes a breakfast by a river that turned a stone. Your bench becomes a small port. Joke 3 arrives when Butterwife Joan eyes the sesame rolls and declares them fashionable. You tell her fashion is just hunger in its party clothes. She laughs, buys 2, and suggests you sprinkle poppy next, then whispers that the apothecary insists poppy seeds cure tedious conversations. You purchase a pinch of poppy for research and declare the shop now a centre for medical innovation. You keep faith with your roots while you borrow. The assize loaf remains your daily oath. The almoner's rounds keep their barley ears. The mouse loaf squeaks on schedule, but your crust now wears occasional seeds. Your scoring sometimes hums that bishop staff curve. Your steam remembers a northern rag. Your sieve sings a new note. The warden notices. He pretends not to, then corners you by the mop to ask how the sealed door keeps ears from misbehaving. You trade a demonstration for a story about his first burn and his first pride. He shows you a scar. You show him the cabbage leaf charm, travelling above the sill like a saint on holiday. Historians still argue whether medieval Europe was culinarily conservative or exuberantly hybrid. You suspect both, toggled by price, peace, and personality. On ordinary mornings, you bake what steadies a street. On generous ones, you take a seed from another shore and roll it across a crust until neighbours learn its name. You stamp the sleepy fish and feel it wink. A local sign, global seasoning. Night leans in with a mild shoulder. You bag a sesame crown for the widow who pretends she doesn't like surprises. You tuck a dimply blessing eye for Joachim with the badge. You set a scald for tomorrow's rye, cover the mother, and watch bubbles write their tiny script. At the door you touch the breadboard, charm, wheat, star, fish, then add 1 dot with a bit of coal, a private mark meaning borrowed well. The curfew bell hums. You bank coals. The room smells like Rosemary's memory, sesame's rumour, and flour that has learned a new vowel. You whisper thanks to travellers, to drums, to jars that sailed, to ovens that speak dialects through brick and breath. Then you turn down the lamp and listen to crusts cool, the soft clicks translating the day into rest. You bank the day, the way you bank the coals, slow, deliberate, with a hand that has learned not to rush endings. The warden's rake sighs home. The communal oven breathes like a great creature choosing a nap. You slide your last peel across the sill and feel the heat lean away from ambition toward memory. Your shop answers in small clicks, as crusts cool polite applause for a performance the town didn't notice it needed. You tally tokens. Each wooden piece returns to its square, stamped and simple, a census of heat shared without quarrel. The apprentice counts aloud, then forgets to, then traces your sleepy fish on the table with a damp fingertip like a child rehearsing a signature. You don't correct him. Habit is a lullaby you hum with your hands. You sweep the bench with slow strokes. Flour drifts and settles. A brief weather system that can't quite decide whether to snow or to bless. You lift baskets, shake out linens, fold them into rectangles that satisfy the part of your brain that likes right angles. Your spouse draws a line under the ledger, ink pausing in the gentle tale that means enough for today. The shop smells of Rosemary's Ghost, Sesame's Rumour, and the quiet metallic truth of cooling brass weights on their hook. Mainstream fact, tucked into the evening like salt into dough. You cover the fire. Curfew couvre-feu was not only a bell but a practice. A domestic rite. Embers buried under ash, sparks denied oxygen, households agreeing to tomorrow by declining to test tonight. Town bylaws once counted ladders and inspected chimneys. Your own inspection requires only your palm hovering over the hearth until the skin feels the right, safe hush. You press the ash with the flat of the shovel and whisper, "Good." The hearth approves with a low consent. The warden lingers at your door, pretending to adjust his cap while actually waiting for a heel. You hand him one and, because you both enjoy theatre, thank his eyebrows for their service. He smirks without admitting it, and points with the heel toward your breadboard charm. "Shine that," he says, before it forgets it's important. You promise to oil it with walnut tomorrow, when the sun has time to watch. You portion the staff meal, panada of day-old crumb and onions, a ladle of the stew the apothecary swore was medicinal because he put 2 sprigs of Latin in it. The apprentice declares it curative for puns. Your spouse threatens to report you both to the Guild of Groans. Joke one peeks from behind the ladle, winks, and retires. Cooling is a physics you've learned to read like scripture. Loaves sing tiny tinks and sighs, the starch is setting, moisture equalizing, ear relaxing from boast to contentment. You space them on racks so steam leaves politely instead of condensing into sulk. The mouse loaf squeaks for the widow's grandchild at the exact decibel that makes the street cat file another complaint. You set some rounds on their sides so the bottoms don't dampen a trick you stole from a miller's wife who had no patience for swampy heels. Quirky tidbit drifts in with the broom. A cooper once swore his grandmother stuck a knife upright in a fresh loaf to let the devil out before bed and to keep thieves away, because thieves, apparently, respected cutlery more than custom. You have never stabbed bread. You gently tap the bench knife twice, instead the wolf-mouth ward, and let devils, if any, become yeast metaphors. Coins rattle like rain in a tin roof as you sort the day's take. The hold penny you wear as a talisman lives back on its cord. Credit notes tally stick halves. A chalk mark on a shard of slate go into the "when better" pouch your spouse keeps like a promise. The inspector's moustache remains uninvited to supper, but receives in absentia your most courteous thought. "We did fine." Joke 2 almost writes that in the ledger. Your spouse confiscates the quill with due ceremony. Historians still argue whether, in later medieval towns, private ovens quietly proliferated despite official bakehouse monopolies, enforcement waxing and waning with magistrates' zeal and neighbourhoods' tolerance for risk. You've seen little kilns in courtyards wink like secrets, and you've seen thatch that learned fire the hard way. You stand by the communal mouth because it keeps arguments short and roofs boring. Boring roofs are civilization. You walk the last loaves to their sleeps. A crown for the gate watch, 2 leaners for the almoner, marked with barley so the warden can pluck them early. A sesame moon for Butterwife Joan because fashion is a morale booster. A dimply blessing eye for Joachim with the badge. You leave a heel on the sill for the miller's dog, who nods civilly at proper sums. On your way back, you find a note tucked under your door. Your rye scald taught my winter manners. From a woman who bakes 2 streets over. You place it on the shelf with your first lopsided stamp and the scorched peel tip. Relics that remind you craft is a chorus. Inside, tools return to their roosts. The lame gets its blade wrapped like a tiny knight. The stamp's face receives a whisper of oil. The peel stands upright, long shadow across the floor, like a kind uncle watching the door. The ash bucket squares its shoulders by the hearth. The water pail sits sentry by the threshold. Sandwich guardians, you call them. The apprentice salutes them solemnly and is promoted on the spot to vice custodian of sensible precautions. You stretch your back until the vertebrae applaud. Your hands, chalk dry, dive into a basin and find warmth. The bowl water clouds with flour and honesty. You pour it out at the step because street stones like a little bakery gossip. Your spouse sweeps one last elegant stripe. The room looks like a page that just earned its period. You lock, then unlock, then lock again, because bakers live by double checks. The lane smells of extinguished things, learning how to be safe in the dark. Tallow, damp wood, bread with its volume turned down. The bell offers curfew's low vowel. Above you, windows blink to black. A cat edits the silence with unlicensed feet. You carry the last heel home like a medal. On your table, beside the ledger, sits the cabbage leaf charm. The far warden insisted you take dry now. faint green stubbornness. You prop it above your own oven mouth, a small calendar entry that says, "You learned something and did not immediately forget." The house approves with an exhale. Before bed you visit the mother leaven. She watches you with her bubble eye, patient as weather. You feed her a spoon of tomorrow and tuck her in with linen that smells faintly of saints' days. "Rest," you tell her. "We have dawn." She answers with a quiet fizz like a "yes, you can sleep" on. Joke 3 ambles by as you snuff the lamp. "If bread dreams, does it dream of better bakers?" You whisper. "No," your spouse says from the doorway. "It dreams of butter that knows when to melt." You carry that answer toward the bed, warm as a bun cooling under a cloth. The town's last door thunks. Your eyelids finish their shift. You've closed the oven. You open sleep. You ease breath longer on the exhale, letting the day unspool like twine from a kindly spool. Street sounds step back. The bench fades to a soft idea wood that remembers your palms but releases them for the night. Coals settle deeper. Red turned to ember, turned to memory. Each stage slower than the last. Each glow a smaller yes. You let yourself match that pace. In the dark, the shop is generous with quiet. Racks hold still silhouettes, arcs and domes resting, nothing urgent left in their shape. The sleepy fish you pressed all day swims now only in thought, a gentle loop that carries you to the edge of the next breath and sets you down without hurry. Bells are done talking, clocks give up on minutes and try hours instead. Even the inspector's mustache stops composing sentences and falls, politely, into silence. You picture the communal oven like a hill sleeping under a light snow. The crack you worried has become a harmless line in a calm face. The warden's peel leans like a staff beside a door that no longer minds being closed. On the far shelf, the breadboard charm holds a soft gleam. Walnut oil dark and calm, wheat and star and fish smooth to a single restful idea. Enough. Neighbours fold into blankets. The gate watch tucks a heel into a pocket and hums. The mill keeps its water talk inside a quieter throat. Somewhere a cat decides not to argue with the moon. You let your jaw soften, then your shoulders, then those tiny muscles around the eyes that spend all day pretending they're tough. None of that now. Not with the oven banked, and the mother leaven fed and tomorrow already arranged in kind lines. If you wish, imagine the crust's cooling clicks far away like small rain on slate. They space out, they thin, they stop. The room goes gentle as a fresh crumb pressed with a fingertip, springing back slowly, then still. Breathe, longer out, softer in. Drift on warmth hidden under ash, on quiet work finished well, on a town that chose its sleep and got it. Good night.